much of the planet is covered by oceans. To most people, they were a barrier. But there was one small group of people who conquered them long before anyone else. They were the first blue water sailors, and this is their story. It is known as the Polynesian Triangle, an area of ocean stretching from Hawaii to New Zealand to Easter Island. It is huge, more than the landmass of Europe and Asia combined. British explorer James Cook was the first to reach all of it. He was also the first to realize that, wherever he went, people had been there before, hundreds, sometimes thousands of years earlier. People who spoke a common language, a race of master sailors descended from the same stock. One of the West's greatest navigators, he was astounded. How shall we account for this nation spreading itself so far over this vast ocean? He wrote. We find them from New Zealand in the south to Hawaii in the north, and from Easter Island to the Hebrides. Phrased more than 200 years ago, the question has kept archaeologists occupied ever since, and it has by no means been resolved. There now is some agreement over when and how the Polynesians fanned out across the Pacific, though much remains based on speculation. And the further we recede in time, the hazier the picture. Because this is not the story of a single continuous migration. There are several steps. Here, on the islands of Papua New Guinea, a first wave of dark-skinned settlers arrived at least 40,000 years ago. Because of the Ice Age, sea levels were lower than they are now, creating land bridges that linked New Guinea and Australia. But getting to that large landmass still involved the crossing of several sea channels. These islands saw the birth of seafaring, at a time not usually associated with seafaring capabilities. About 5,000 years ago, a second wave of migrants arrived. Lighter-skinned and with Asian features, they would later move on into the Pacific, becoming the ancestors of the Polynesians. Of their ships, nothing is known. There are no records or stories. But once they reached the islands northeast of New Guinea, these people left something very distinctive.
Discover the past with exclusive ancient history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians from History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to explore everything from the wonders of Pompeii to the rebellion of Boudica and the mysteries of prehistoric Scotland. Immerse yourself in the captivating stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
We're going to an island called Babassi. When we land at Babassi, our aim is to get to the village of Kumgot. Just behind Kumgot is a Lapita site, about 3,300 years old. The Lapita site itself represents a group of seafaring people who came here and colonized the area and who stayed for maybe a few hundred years, maybe longer.
Glenn Summerhays is an archaeologist with the Australian National University. These islands in Papua New Guinea's Bismarck Archipelago are difficult to reach, but for anyone interested in Polynesian history, they provide important clues. Because the pottery found here tells us a great deal more than what might be expected.
Lapita initially represented highly decorated forms of pottery. It was archaeologically visible. it was easy to identify. And what got people's attention was the fact that it was found over the years from New Guinea all the way up to Samoa. It was the archaeological signature of the first colonisation of what we call remote Oceania. The thing is, people have been living in near Oceania for well over 30,000 years, probably longer. So pottery was found 30,000 years after the first people arrived in these group of islands. So who were the people who made the pottery? How did they interact with the local inhabitants? And these are questions that we really don't have answers for at the moment.
There are still many unknowns about the Lapita people, in other words, which Glenn and his assistants are now trying to uncover. Here on Babase, they have found a rich site.
The site of Kamgot is one of perhaps 3 or 4 of the most important early Lapita sites in the Bismarck Archipelago. It's important for a lot of reasons, but for me, the reason I come back and back again is the fact that we're finding pristine conditions for excavation. We're finding early Lapita pottery. We're finding it in immaculate condition. We're actually finding a Lapita village, a village where tens of thousands of pieces of pottery, bits of obsidian, volcanic glass, shell armbands, fish hooks, all the things from the past that people used in everyday life we're finding in this village. The density is incredible. Within a 1 by 1 metre, we're finding over 3,000 bits of pottery, what we call pottery sherds. We're finding over 300 pieces of obsidian, black volcanic glass. We're finding shell fish hooks. We're finding shell armbands. We're finding teeth with drilled holes in it used as necklaces. This is in a 1 by 1 metre test pit going down no more than 1.2, 1.3 metres.
But it is the pottery which remains the star witness in this part of the story.
We are getting glimpses into the form of interaction between near Oceania and remote Oceania. And this glimpse into the form of interaction is by comparing the pottery designs, the motifs found on Lapita pottery in the areas of Papua New Guinea, and comparing them to those motifs found in Tonga and Samoa. What we're finding is the people that were living here, making the pottery, making the shell armbands, interacted with people from Samoa. What the nature of interaction is, we're not too sure. But we do know that when pottery forms change here, similar changes are occurring in Tonga and Samoa. And this leads me to believe that some form of interaction occurred. Whether it was once a year or once a decade or once 100 years, I'm not too sure.
Hi Steph.
How's it going, Glenn?
What are you finding?
Heaps of good stuff this morning. We've done this really big piece of dentate pottery.
That's
Paul
beautiful.
just finished digging it out.
The Lapita people left more than pottery, in other words. By carefully decorating their earthenware, they also provided insight on when and where they moved into the Pacific.
My guess is that it'll be around 3,300, 3,350.
It's almost new.
Yeah, it's well made, and this is only the top of the pit too. It's an exquisite design. 20 or 30 years ago, people explained the similarity of pottery across the Pacific as a result of trade and exchange. That's the only way they could see the complexity of designs found over a vast area. But now, through petrographic and chemical analysis, we're finding that most of the pottery found in Vanuatu was made in Vanuatu. The pottery in New Caledonia was made in New Caledonia. The pots are not moving. How do you explain the similarity across vast distances? It would have to be that the pots aren't moving, it's the people, it's the ideas are moving. And this explains the movement of people across the Western Pacific.
Whichever way we look at it, it was an impressive migration. Starting in the 2nd millennium BC, the Lapita people began sailing from the Bismarck Archipelago, north of New Guinea, past the Solomon Chain to New Caledonia, Fiji, and Tonga, a route which has become known as the Lapita Corridor. Altogether, it covered more than 2,000 miles, much of it against prevailing winds and currents. was clear the Lapita people also settled Samoa in the Western Pacific, but interestingly, there was very little early evidence of that, until the Samoans decided they needed a larger ferry to connect their islands. At the ferry berth in Mulifanua, on the island of Upolu, a very important discovery was made.
The discovery was entirely accidental. The man was looking for shells where they were dredging out this ferry berth, and he noticed that there were these bits of rock with markings on them, and he wanted to know what they were. He showed them to one of my students who'd worked with me there. He recognized what they were and immediately told me, and I got the sherds from him.
Roger Green, at the time with the University of Auckland, eventually received hundreds of decorated potsherds. It was clear that they represented a key piece of the Lapita puzzle he has helped to solve.
So far, and the reason we haven't found the others is, of course, that Samoa is sinking and they're all underwater.
The missing piece of the puzzle had been submerged, in other words. Now the entire picture became clear.
The distribution of the Lapita runs from the Bismarck Archipelago, 3,000–4,000 kilometers to the west, all the way out to Fiji, Tonga, and now Samoa. And the significance of this find was to find the early site in Samoa and then to show that there was actually material in it that came from Fiji and Tonga and helped us show both the voyaging and the interconnections between these people.
The organic material amidst the rocks also allowed for precise dating, indicating the Lapita people arrived in Samoa between 2,900 and 2,700 years ago. But most evidence relating to that early presence still lies submerged.
Well, what I want is a dredge, some dynamite, and, enough money to look in several places. I have a map of where to look.
And the right permission.
Yes.
There now is agreement that the Lapita settlers of the Western Pacific stayed there for some time, maybe 500 years or even longer, becoming Polynesian in the process. During that time, they changed their cooking methods, increasingly relying on earth ovens rather than pots. Before long, the pottery disappeared altogether, and with it the sherds that enabled archaeologists to track the movements of their Lapita ancestors. Sometime in the first millennium BC, these people moved east as well, into the expanse of the Pacific.
I take what I call a punctuated view of this. In other words, there were a series of pauses in the settlement of the Pacific, and this movement had to do with improving transport mechanisms. And the particular development there that was the most important was the development of the double canoe.
While this helps explain how they moved on, it doesn't cover why they did so. All we can do is speculate about their motivation.
They were out there looking for new islands and expecting to find them. That was the view that these people in the Pacific had. And the interesting thing is archaeologists find it almost impossible to go to any piece of real estate in this whole area of remote Oceania without finding that people have been there before.
Even so, there is uncertainty over which piece of real estate was first settled. In absence of pottery, archaeologists have to look for different clues. There is logic in common sense, for instance, which would point to a first site nearer rather than further from the point of departure. In the case of Tonga and Samoa, this would suggest an arrival in the Cook Islands. Some archaeologists believe this is where the Polynesians first arrived, though the material evidence to prove so has not yet been uncovered. Beyond are the islands of French Polynesia, which could also claim an early arrival based on common sense. In at least one case, there also seems to be a linguistic connection. The islands of Taha and Raiatea, for instance, used to be called Upuru and Hawaii, names that are almost identical to those of the Samoan islands from which the first migrants might have left. It could be mere coincidence, though Raiatea, or erstwhile Hawaii, is traditionally seen as the sacred island from which much of Polynesia was later colonized. That sacred role is confirmed by the number of marae, or ancient temples here, including the temple of Tapu Tapu Atea, still the most sacred site in all of Polynesia. But these structures date from a much later time. Thus far, there is no archaeological evidence to confirm Raiatea's early role in the settlement of the Pacific. Within sight of Tapu Tapu Atea is the island of Huahine, another possible candidate for an early settlement site. But the earliest remnants found here thus far date to about the 8th or 9th century. In spite of this relatively late start, Huahine too played a prominent role in Polynesian history, as is clear from the many marae that are scattered throughout the island. Some are among the largest and most important in all of Polynesia, though the most intriguing perhaps are the many smaller temples that were built side by side along the lagoon near Maeva village. Much of what we know about the archaeology of this part of Polynesia is the result of the work of Professor Kenneth Emery in the 1930s. It was continued by his student, Yoshihiko Sonoto, now one of the greatest Polynesian experts himself.
1929, my professor, Dr. Emery, came to Tahiti, and during his honeymoon, he recorded marae all over the Society Islands. And of course, he came to Huahine. He said that Maeva is a very unique place because all the chiefs of Huahine lived side by side very peacefully. So that the Maeva area was a taboo area for commoners.
High above the temples along the lagoon, on Matarea Hill, Dr. Sonoto discovered even more ruins. But maintaining these structures is a struggle. The forest quickly takes over in this part of the world.
This is a constant problem. Every year we come back from Honolulu, we clear by ourselves, by our funds. We're asking the Tahitian government to maintain the place because this is good for the tourist attraction as well as educational sites. But since we found the site in 1979 and actually restored partially in 1984, a constant problem to maintain that place.
But the efforts are clearly worth it, for there is much to be learned from this site. Aside from the temples, there are burial sites, foundations of homes for priests and chiefs, as well as fortifications, proving life here was not all peaceful and quiet. In spite of the obvious importance of Huahine and its neighbors in the Polynesian story, Dr. Sonoto is convinced that these islands were bypassed by the first Polynesian migrants. But where then did they go? And where did they settle?
Polynesian legend tells us that their ancestors came from west and came to Tahiti area. And Tahiti is the head of octopus. Then from there dispersed. But I had a chance to go to Marquesas in 1964 and 65, and based on my excavation and the radiocarbon dates, that settlers in the Marquesas Island probably reached there about 0 BC to 300 AD. From that, I proposed that Marquesas Island was probably the center of dispersal for East Polynesia.
It remains a controversial hypothesis, since it would have required the first Polynesian migrants to sail an enormous distance, against the wind and against the current, and against reason and logic, it seems, for there are plenty of islands in between. But there is no question that there was an early presence in the Marquesas, with some of the earliest evidence of humans in all of East Polynesia having been located here. And there is no question that these early arrivals would disperse in turn and move far beyond, still puzzling people who have studied them for nearly a lifetime.
Why they have to move so quickly, such an early period? Because even AD 850, there's plenty place. And I have been saying that why they have to move was that the nature of the Polynesians. They have ocean-going canoes, they have a knowledge of navigation, and they know how to preserve food.
That knowledge would have been particularly useful, because on one of their next moves, the Polynesians managed to reach the most isolated island on the planet. Until the Marquesas, the early Polynesians at least had the benefit of encountering islands along their way from the western Pacific. But beyond that, the island chain stopped. Between the Marquesas and the South American coast were no more than a few small islands, including this one, more than 1,000 miles from its nearest neighbor. Today, it still relies on the coming and going of ships to provide supplies. And with hardly a port to accommodate them, they have to be unloaded at sea. The arrival of the first people here still ranks as one of the greatest feats in human migration. After all, the island is no more than a lone volcanic outcropping of some 50 square miles, more than 2,000 miles upwind from the Marquesas, and further still from the rest of French Polynesia. If any island on the planet should have been missed, this would have been it, and yet the Polynesians didn't. In fact, they settled it, and soon left impressive proof of their presence.
We're facing Ahu Pico, located on the western side of the island, and is a ceremonial altar, one of the 300 of this kind.
Archaeologist turned businessman Sergio Rapu is keenly involved in restoring the many statues known as moai that are found here on Easter Island, or Rapa Nui as it is known throughout Polynesia. Part of that commitment includes a daily visit to Hangu Piku to confer with his brother Raphael, who is overseeing the altar's restoration.
The site has one moai, has a central platform nicely defined, and we're in the final stage of giving the final touch of restoration of the site. We have spent almost 9 months in different phases of the work, excavating first, documenting and gathering all the evidence that help date the site and put in historical perspective. And now we're actually finishing by putting the final stone on the platforms and the pavement in the back.
Much has been written about the how and why of these colossal statues. But while there is some uncertainty about how the Easter Islanders managed to transport the statues from the quarry to their final location, there is no longer doubt about their function.
The cult of the ancestor is a common practice, a religious practice from Southeast Asia all the way to Easter Island. And in different islands and different regions, the ancestor was represented differently. In some cases you will have a very small stone statue. Some cases you will have a flat stone where the ancestor is supposed to sit. In other cases you will find a cairn or a pile of rocks that indicating the presence of the ancestor. And in Easter Islands, these ancestor figures, shaped like human figure at the beginning, became a unique figure of these islands.
Aside from honoring the ancestors, the statues may also provide clues on when these ancestors arrived. Tradition holds that the first canoe was led by Hotumatua, who arrived at Anakena Beach from Te Hiva, the ancestral homeland. But thus far, there is no universal agreement on when that would have taken place.
The carbon dating we have established 7th century dating from Ahutahai. I will expect to find the first evidence of human occupation of this island several centuries further back from Ahutahai, that is around 3 to 4 century AD. That could lead then Easter Island to be one of the earliest occupied sites in East Polynesia. And the reason I push back several centuries from Ahutahai date is because Ahutahai is already one kind of religious altar that have distanced itself from the ancestor figures or form of Marae that we suspect probably derived from.
And so the statues may also confirm the likely departure point of the first settlers.
The Rapa Nui culture, based on the comparison with other Polynesian cultures, suggests first that we're firmly an East Polynesian culture. Now, where exactly we came from in East Polynesia, we have to look from places that were first settled before Easter Islands. And the most immediate place that is at least suggested for a long time is the Marquesas Islands.
With Easter Island, the Marquesans settled the most easterly point of the Polynesian Triangle. Not long after their voyages east, they also set out in a northerly direction. Nearly 2,000 miles further, they reached a new island chain. How they managed to find it, no one knows. After all, no one could have known whether there was land in that direction, though the Marquesans probably suspected as much after observing the flight path of birds. Unfortunately, the first people here didn't leave any statues to help us figure out when they reached Hawaii. But there are other ways that this can be determined.
The sinkholes here on southwestern Oahu formed in an old coral reef. The reef formed when the sea was higher than at present. The sea dropped down again, left the coral reef high and dry, and rainwater, being a little bit acidic, after dissolving carbon dioxide, in the softer parts, the more soluble parts of this reef, have dissolved what we call sinkholes. And through thousands of years, as they were forming, any birds or other animals that happened to fall in a sinkhole and couldn't get out again would leave their bones in the sink.
Alan Ziegler is a zoologist who specializes in Hawaii's native fauna. The job often takes him deep into the sinkholes to search for the remains of birds and other animals.
We take the bones and other animal material out of these sinkholes by different levels, and in general the top level will be the youngest and the bottom level the oldest. And then we can take just a bone or two from one of these layers and radiocarbon date it, and we can tell that layer is maybe 5,000 years old or is only 500 years old. But there's another interesting thing we can do about those levels. If we keep the material from each consecutive level separate and analyze it separately, down at the bottom, the very lowest levels in these sinkholes, we'll find, for instance, all native land snails. And then as we come up younger and younger levels, then all of a sudden a particular tiny little snail that was introduced by Polynesians all over the Central Pacific, including Hawaii, that snail turns up in that layer. So we know that layer must post-date the time the earliest Hawaiians got here.
And it is so, by carefully examining layer after layer and searching for clues to changes in the environment brought about by the first humans, that some idea can be obtained on the timing of their arrival.
It's just judging from what few dates I know and so on. I'm not an archaeologist. I would think maybe 1,500 years ago the first Hawaiians got here.
Hawaiian legends convey a later date, but they refer to a second wave of immigrants. These people left more concrete evidence of their presence, and their chants trace their royal lineage all the way back to the time when men came from afar, from the ancestral homeland of Kahiki. By converting the successive generations to years, that would have taken place 1,000 years ago. They also speak of a period of voyages back and forth to the islands they left. And it was these voyages that would inspire a more recent generation of Hawaiians to build a voyaging canoe and rediscover their maritime roots.
If we want to do the Hawaii-Tahiti trips, and you take the genealogies and you count the generation, it looks like the heyday was around 1200 AD.
But no one knew what a canoe of that era would have looked like. It didn't deter anthropologist Ben Finney and his colleagues.
Technically what we're doing is experimental archaeology. The ideal of experimental archaeology is to take an archaeologically recovered artifact and duplicate it with the same materials and the same construction techniques, and then test it to see how it works. But canoes don't sink because they have no ballast. So we have no archaeologically recovered example.
Fortunately, there were other sources that could be used.
We studied all the canoes as recorded by Cook and other Europeans, and they made some exquisite drawings. And we tried to develop a common denominator design that would be an archaic East Polynesian canoe.
And so was born the first Polynesian voyaging canoe replica. Her name is Hōkūleʻa, Hawaiian for Arcturus, the island's zenith star. But some shortcuts had to be made.
We knew we could not build a 60-foot, 19-meter canoe the old way of hand cutting the pieces with stone adzes and fitting them together and sewing them together and so forth. We'd still be working on it now. So we made it with modern materials. We tried to keep the shape right and the weight right. So we had a heavy, we thought, well-shaped replica.
Though no one will ever know whether it is also an accurate replica, Hōkūleʻa undoubtedly possesses some of the old voyaging canoe's principal characteristics.
It's a double canoe that is twin hulls, symmetrical. This gives you stability and carrying capacity. Outriggers are fine, maybe a little faster, more maneuverable, less load carrying, and very tippy. So this is a voyaging canoe for transporting lots of people.
Over the past 25 years, Hōkūleʻa has traveled all over the Pacific. In the process, much has been learned and relearned about Polynesian sailing and navigation, and about the conditions that would have existed on the original voyages.
I can imagine that a canoe like that would take 40 people, 60 people, in which case it's loaded, it's low in the water, it's slow, and you have only limited food and water supplies. Surprising enough, one of the problems is cold, because you go out there with a stiff wind and a lot of head seas hitting you, a lot of spray over you. You get very cold, you lose body heat, and you lose too much, you die. But it didn't deter them. All the islands worth living on got populated.
There now was only one direction left to explore in the Pacific. Sometime around the end of the first millennium, perhaps even earlier, people from the central Pacific islands of French Polynesia headed that way. They first sailed to the Cook Islands, and from there they headed south to Aotearoa, the land of the long white cloud, now known far less poetically as New Zealand. They knew there would have been land there because birds could be seen heading that way. But they didn't know how far it was, and that it would be a tough trip into decisively less tropical waters. Difficulties that are still recollected in the Maori's rich oral tradition.
The chant comes from an elder in Northlands, about 70 years old. It refers to an ancestor named Nuku Tawhiti who came on a waka called Rātoki Mata Whaorua. The specific chant is about calming the seas as he entered the Hokianga harbour. It's very old and very archaic, goes back well over 20 generations ago.
Rawiri Tawanui is a historian at the University of Auckland who specialises in the Maori's unique waka traditions.
Waka traditions are about arrival, settlement and dispersal around the North and South Islands of New Zealand. A long genealogy, which you can take some history from, typically might be 40 to say 60 generations long. You know, so it's a recitation of names, but above say 25 generations, something like that, it contains elements that are symbolic as well as historical.
Aside from the difficulties of distinguishing between symbolism and history, there are elements that have tainted this oral record.
If traditions talk too much about the place they came from, like it's quite detailed about, say, Tahiti or Rarotonga, then that's usually been acquired through European knowledge. The earlier material is more oblique, more symbolic. The more oral tradition you learn, the easier it is to pick up the discrepancies in language, style, context and detail, and it's quite easy to pick out what's been inserted after 1900.
Given the complexities involved and the possible addition of foreign elements, much of Polynesia's oral history has been treated with caution, if not skepticism. But Rawiri Tawanui is convinced it contains much valuable information in regard to the Polynesian expansion, and especially their arrival in the most southern part of the Polynesian Triangle.
Western scholars have always searched for the first arrival, and the thing is that different tribes have their own version of who the first arrival is. There are 20 or 30 waka traditions that are well known throughout the country, but waka traditions contain multiple layers, and so they contain elements which are about migrations in the Pacific, elements which are about migrations from the Pacific to New Zealand, and then other elements that are about migrations inside New Zealand. Now that's just the 20 or 30 main canoe traditions. Looking wider than that, there's nearly 400 canoes in our traditions, and some of those are very old and very obscure, and it may well be that amongst those less well-known traditions, that one of them in fact is the first.
Upon careful analysis, oral traditions match the archaeological record quite well, especially as far as the arrivals from central Polynesia are concerned. But they may also contain information about much earlier arrivals.
One of my thoughts is that there's perhaps an early arrival from West Polynesia, because in one part of our country, west coast of the North Island, there are a number of genealogies and snippets of tradition which don't fit with East Polynesia. Now, archaeologists would say that's heresy, but it fits with a scenario that the navigators who came from Melanesia into Polynesia were good at navigating. They were sophisticated, they knew what they were doing, and there's no reason for them to stop there. It also fits with the scenario that if there was a contact from West Polynesia, it was long ago, it was brief.
Though there is no archaeological evidence for such a voyage, there is no reason why it couldn't have taken place at an early stage. In fact, according to a theory developed by Jeff Irwin, also of the University of Auckland, it would have made eminent sense.
In 1985, I decided to take my own boat up to New Guinea. And as we sailed up to Fiji and then through the islands of Melanesia, what we were actually doing was retracing the steps of the Lapita colonists who'd been sailing the other way. And I began to think, what would it have been like for them sailing in the opposite direction, generally against the wind? For us it was really easy. We were sailing with the easterly trade winds. We were slipping easily downwind. And I began to realise that it was the ease of sailing with the wind that made exploring against the wind possible. Because in the event of not finding land, all they had to do was turn around, take the trade winds, and then run back down on their starting island. Obviously, it was the safe thing to do.
The safe thing to do also appeared to fit the archaeological evidence. But Irwin's was only one of many theories, and not necessarily an easy one to prove.
What we thought we'd do was we would send off voyages in the computer, and we would see if we could get the computer to duplicate the archaeological evidence. And the beauty of a computer is that you can set off thousands of voyages, and you can give the results an opportunity to stabilise statistically. So the computer was going to give you patterns in the results.
The results confirmed that an early voyage to New Zealand, even in late Lapita times, would have been possible, and not necessarily more challenging than other voyages undertaken by the first Pacific voyagers. They also help explain why the main migration from central Polynesia to New Zealand would take place so much later.
New Zealand is the most difficult archipelago in Polynesia to reach because it's south of the tropics, it's in a different weather system, and there can be worse weather down here. And coming down here in this direction puts crews at real risk because they mightn't be able to return.
So the first voyages from central Polynesia may have been tentative steps.
We're going to let those canoes try and find their way back if they don't find land, so that's strategy number 4, which is a return voyage. The month is January, so there are going to be some pretty good easterly winds for them to come. 10 canoes in that fleet, and we're going to give them 7 weeks. Now, they're not going to quite make New Zealand, so 16 days is their turnaround day, and their angle out is still 230 degrees on the compass. So we input that data, and out we go, and off they go exploring, and each canoe is picking up its winds and so on for each day. Okay, let's have a look. We'll show the voyages, and there they are, and we'll zoom them up. So we'll just have a look and see what's happened. Now, these canoes have left Rarotonga. They've sailed in the right direction. They went out for 16 days, and one of them hit the Kermadec on the way out. The green lines stop where they've actually run out of time, and now they've turned around. Those red lines, they're trying to find their way home. A couple of those canoes have run into the most southern of the Kermadecs, and the rest have got back either to the Southern Cooks. This one here looks as if it's got to the Australs. So strategy 4 has enabled these canoes to go searching for land. They've gone in the right direction. They turn around too quick, but they've all stayed alive.
Sailing into the wind, often seen as the greatest obstacle to the colonization of the Pacific, made sense because it maximized the chances of survival in case of failure. It helps us understand why the Polynesians first sailed east, perhaps as far as South America, before heading north and south to Hawaii and New Zealand. And it makes clear that the process was deliberate and controlled. But it doesn't explain why it all eventually came to an end.
In the last millennium, it looks as if the frequency of voyaging has slowed down, and that's a real mystery. The places where people kept on communicating are the exceptions, not the rule, and we can only wonder why voyaging stopped. Two thoughts come to my mind. One is that the focus of people's attention became internal as populations grew and as society became more complex and maybe competitive. And the other reason is because the process of exploration had a feedback component. It was understood that the islands which were found were all that there were.
It appears that once colonized, the Pacific did indeed become a more complex place. Though there still was inter-island voyaging, around the middle of the first millennium, these contacts too began to fall. Rather than expending energy on great voyages, more time and effort was devoted to complex religious rituals and monuments, a process that consumed vast resources. And in places like Easter Island, this would have dramatic effects.
The island is limited in natural resource, and the pristine ecosystem is so fragile that once a new population comes in, it can disturb quickly. If this new population of Polynesians were growing continuously, they will demand the clearing of the land to plant more food and feed them. And because of this process, the forest formation was quickly deteriorated.
Deforestation in turn led to poorer soils, resulting in less food for a growing population. This created hunger, conflict, and finally war. The great statues were toppled and abandoned. But it was too late.
By causing deforestation, the ancient Rapa Nui have created a trap for themselves, not only in protection of their soils and ecosystem, but also in eliminating wood that would have been so important to make a large canoe and will let them navigate to other destiny. So they were trapped here. They didn't have the wood necessary to make canoes.
Elsewhere in the Pacific, society had become more complex as well. Pacific cultures became less hospitable, eliminating the principal motivation for traveling, to explore, to settle, and afterwards to stay in touch. So there too, the great voyagers eventually stopped voyaging. Ironically, they did so at a time when others began arriving in the Pacific. People who set out to sea with totally different motivations, to make money, to dominate, or to impose their religion. Western explorers were surprised to find people wherever they went. How they got there seemed inconceivable. The natives' tales of great voyages were dismissed. It wasn't until James Cook arrived that it became clear their legends were based in fact, that these people had found out all over the largest ocean on the planet long before anyone else. How shall we account for this nation spreading itself so far over this vast ocean? Until that question is fully answered, the story of the human conquest of the sea can never be complete. Because these people wrote its first chapter. It is known as a land of mountains and deserts, but it too developed a great seafaring tradition. The seas surrounding the Arab world witnessed the birth of sea trade. Their mariners wrote much of its early history. This is their story. It is morning along the East African coast. Here, as elsewhere, seamen and fishermen are preparing to head out to sea. In many of its backwaters, they still do so on sailing ships, as they have for hundreds of years. Far to the north, along the coast of the Arabian Peninsula, people are preparing their ships as well. Here too, some still rely on the wind, as do seamen in India and throughout the Indian Ocean. The East African ships seem slightly different, but not by much, for they all share the same triangular sail known as a latine. The ships are known as dhows. Today, the last survivors still head out to sea, though not because of sentimental reasons. They mostly survive out of necessity and poverty. One day their sails will also set, though the ships will hopefully not be forgotten. For theirs is a fascinating story, which affected much of maritime history. Their story begins further west, in Egypt. Organized life tended to develop along waterways, and ancient Egypt was no exception. One of the world's largest rivers, the Nile provided a fertile floodplain along which people settled thousands of years ago. Beyond was the desert, hundreds of miles of it. It formed a natural barrier, protecting the country from foreign armies and ideas. Here, one of the world's most enduring civilizations emerged. And connecting all of its people was the great river itself, much the same way it does to this day. Here, the recorded history of ships and shipping began. More than 6,000 years ago, people were already navigating this river, using craft assembled from reeds and propelled by men paddling along the sides. 1,000 years later, ships with sails appeared on the Nile. Unlike the triangular sails of today's feluccas, they were square and set on a double mast. Shortly thereafter, shipbuilders began using wood instead of reeds, creating a hull that could keep people and cargo dry. Traffic along the river grew rapidly. To sail south to Upper Egypt, the ships could run before the prevailing northerly winds. On the way back, they relied on oars or poles, a task lightened by the current. And so the Nile developed into the connecting link that bound the country together, a natural highway for its trade and commerce. But ships did more than carry Egypt's commerce. They also figured prominently in religious practices, for they were believed to carry the deceased to the afterworld. People who could afford a tomb had one or more boat models placed in it. Thousands of these have survived to this day, providing a wealth of information on Egyptian ships. And just in case models weren't sufficient, the most powerful rulers had entire ships buried with them. In 1954, a pit was discovered next to the Pyramid of Cheops in Giza. The architects had sealed it so efficiently that, when the limestone blocks were removed, the great pharaoh's funeral ship, carefully disassembled, was found in near perfect condition. Then came the challenge of reassembling the more than 1,200 pieces, a task that took years of painstaking work. The result was astounding. What emerged was the life-size funeral bark for one of the Old Kingdom's principal rulers, 140 feet long and almost 20 feet wide. At more than 4,600 years, it is the oldest ship in the world. It is also one of the most impressive. Here is displayed a level of skill that rivals the Great Pyramids themselves. The ship's reconstruction provided invaluable insight, revealing how the builders used mortise and tenon joints to hold the planks and lash the ship together to provide structural strength. The Egyptians also meticulously recorded the technique for posterity. Near the step pyramid of Djoser is the 4,000-year-old tomb of Ti. A powerful court official, Ti had the walls of his tomb adorned with scenes from everyday life, including the construction of the Nile ships he enjoyed so much. The entire process is depicted step by step. Workmen are using stone hammers to pound down the planks. Others are seen using adzes to shape the hull and finish the boards. Thanks to Egypt's dry climate, we also have an idea of what these boats would have looked like in real life. Beyond the bent pyramid in the burial site of Dashur are the remains of the pyramid built for Middle Kingdom pharaoh Sesostris III. Though little remains of it, his funeral ships survived in their entirety.
They are very important. They are a complete boat at the beginning, and they are the only life-size complete boat which arrived from the Middle Kingdom.
Nadia Lokma is one of the Egyptian Museum's chief conservators. One of her key projects focuses on the two Dashur boats that have been kept at the museum for the past 100 years.
They are really very, very well constructed. They can amaze you when you look to how they put them together, how they use the mortise and tenon, how they use the dovetail join, how they connect pieces sometimes with using a leather band or something like that. They are wonderful.
Full-sized and hardly altered since they were buried nearly 4,000 years ago, the Dashur boats complete our knowledge of Egyptian shipbuilding. In spite of their significance, their survival is not assured. Dr. Lokma realizes it will take a lot of effort to preserve them for future generations.
They need a lot of work, and they need to control the climate around them. They need a showcase, because you see, we have the problem of dust here. Oh my goodness, a lot of dust. And the visitors, they like to touch it, they like just to feel it, and this is not really good for the boat. So we need to have a showcase for it. We need to do more restoration about it, and that long process will take time, because you have to do it with a lot of patience and of love. If not, you can't really do anything.
By the time the Dasher boats were buried, Egyptian ships traveled far beyond the safety of the Nile. They regularly sailed to Lebanon and the Levant to obtain wood. Ships also arrived with cargoes of copper from the Sinai Peninsula and exotic goods from the mythical land of Punt, now believed to have been located along the north coast of Somalia. As early as 4,500 years ago, the Egyptians sent a fleet down the entire length of the Red Sea to Punt. But the most famous expedition dates to the reign of Queen Hatshepsut, about 1,000 years later. The expedition of 5 ships was immortalized in the Queen's magnificent mortuary temple at Deir al-Bahri, near the Valley of the Kings. The first illustrated account of a trading voyage, the colored reliefs depict the ships and their crews. Accompanied by detailed descriptions, they show how the Egyptians were received in Punt and how they returned, their ships deeply loaded with exotic woods and fragrances. Never, so the inscriptions boast, was the like brought back to any monarch since the world began. Though the reliefs are now badly fading, the ship seems some 100 feet in length, with 15 rowers on each side and 2 men to control the side rudders. Each ship had 1 mast, which supported a broad square sail. These were the best ships ancient Egypt ever produced, and they completed remarkable voyages. And though they would later be modified, they are the model from which many ships in and around Arabian seas later developed. Of course, with nearly 3,500 years separating them, it may be hard to find a resemblance to the wooden dhows that still trade today in the southern Red Sea. The cargoes, too, are far less exotic than what the ancient Egyptians obtained. They are everyday staples: bottled gas for cooking, water, canned goods, rice and sugar. With relatively few large ports in the area, wooden dhows still do a brisk business here, though most have long given up their masts and rigging. But some dhows still hold on to sail. The Fal-Heer is one of them. A small ship known as a Huahine, she's just 55 feet in length. Fully loaded, she'll hold 30 tons of cargo. Mohammed Hamado is owner of the ship. He used to captain her himself. Now he stays ashore, making sure his ships are busy. But Mohammed is worried. It has been blowing hard the past several days, keeping most vessels confined to port. Supervising the loading is Saleh, Mohammed's son, now the young captain or Nakoda of the Fal-Heer. Saleh doesn't like this weather either, but he knows the vessel can handle it, provided the cargo is properly stowed and covered. Like the dhows of old, the Fal-Heer is an open vessel. There are small decks fore and aft, but most of the hold is exposed to the elements. Seawater would quickly ruin the cargo, so several watertight covers are carefully laid over it. Even here, within the shelter of the port, it proves a handful. Cautioned by the harbour master that the wind isn't likely to ease, Saleh orders the sides of the ship to be raised and covered as well. Breaking waves and spray have to be kept out of the open ship to ensure a safe passage. This trade across the Red Sea has been conducted for thousands of years, but we know very little about its early history. In fact, the earliest records of the maritime activities of the coastal Arabs were not recorded here, but much farther north, in Alexandria.
There was a fishing port here, and so when Alexander came here and he found an ideal place for his capital of Egypt, this is how Alexandria sort of blossomed, and then his general who took over after Alexander's death, Ptolemy, started invested heavily in its development.
Alexandria's claim to fame was its Pharos, or lighthouse. Archaeologist Douglas Haldane of the Institute of Nautical Archaeology is documenting what is left of it.
We're looking at the foundations of the Pharos, which are covered by medieval Mamluk construction, and we've been excavating the cistern initially to learn more about the medieval period, but also to learn how it relates to what remains of the Pharos, which is the first thing you see as you're approaching Alexandria and the last thing you see as you leave.
Unfortunately, nowadays there is little left to see. A victim of several earthquakes, the lighthouse finally toppled in 1307. The current fortress was built on its foundation. A similar fate was shared by most of ancient Alexandria. Natural and human destruction did away with one of the most significant trading ports in the ancient world. What remains from that time is confined to a small area, or lies underwater in the city's harbor.
Alexandria was basically the interface between the East and the West, between the Mediterranean and the Eastern world, India, the Arabian Peninsula, East Africa, all the trade coming from there.
And that trade was marvelously described by an Alexandrian merchant 2,000 years ago in a book called The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea.
Basically, the Periplus is a guide to Indian Ocean trading. It tells you the distances and places to go to, what kind of trade items that you can find there, how much they will cost, perhaps who you can deal with, what to look out for. Basically a guide to trade in the Indian Ocean.
And like a good guide, the Periplus is filled with sound advice. The Arabian coast of the Red Sea is dangerous, it's said, because it is without harbors, with bad anchorages, and terrible in every way. Not that there seemed to be a good reason to stop. The land was inhabited by rascally men speaking two languages, by whom those sailing off the middle course were plundered. Move on as fast as possible, the Periplus wisely concluded. Further south, things improved. Musa near Mocha was crowded with Arab shipowners and seafaring men. Its mariners went to the far side coast, the Periplus observed, proving that the ancestors of the Fal-Heer's crew were making the trip across the Red Sea at least 2,000 years ago. Beyond the Red Sea was the South Arabian coast. This was the land of Arabia Felix, or Fortunate Arabia, as the Periplus called it. A fortunate region indeed, because it grew one of the ancient world's rarest products. Its source was a scrub-like tree, which grew in dry and isolated regions near the coast. There were no fruits on it. Instead, it was harvested by carefully removing the outer layer of bark and then scraping into the green layer underneath. Almost immediately, the tree excreted its resin, which could be harvested when dried. Known as frankincense, it was literally worth its weight in gold. Today, frankincense is still traded in the souks of South Arabia, though it hardly compares with the trade and prices of old. Merchants from all over the ancient world came here to buy the precious incense. To the Egyptians, it was the perfume of the gods. This is what they obtained from Punt when Queen Hatshepsut sent her fleet there 3,500 years ago. To the Hebrews, the white smoke represented purity and divinity. The Romans used it in cremation rites, the amount burned measuring both wealth and grief. Even the Indians came here to obtain frankincense, and there are indications it found its way to the Chinese as well, thousands of years ago. Here was a product so simple, so pure, and so perfect that everyone wanted it. Most of the early trade went overland, with camel caravans taking the incense from the coast north, through the entire Arabian Peninsula. Kingdoms along the incense route became rich and powerful in the process. There was Saba, for instance, once ruled by the mythical Queen of Sheba. Yemen's capital of Sana'a also traces its origins to the rich trade, as did many towns and kingdoms along the road, each jealously guarding its share. But their fortunes fell when the trade shifted from camels to ships, shortly before the Christian era. From the South Arabian coast, the vessels traveled to the Red Sea, and then north to Alexandria and the Mediterranean. This was the route the Periplus covered, and it described the great frankincense ports along the way: Kana, Shir, and Mosha, or Sumhuram as it was locally known.
What we are watching now is in the natural harbor of the ancient Sumhuram, which is created by the Wadi Darbat coming out from the mountains where the frankincense was cultivated and was transported to this small town, from where it was shipped to Kana first, and then from there to Mediterranean and to India.
Roberto Orazi is head of the Italian mission in Dhofar, which is excavating the ancient port of Sumhuram.
We are staying on this small fortified town, which was created around the beginning of our era in order to protect the harbor itself. Although there was no need of protection, according to what the Periplus was saying, it was saying that the frankincense here was left on the harbor unguarded, and that no one would ever dare to steal even a grain, because then the god would not allow the ship to start.
Much has been found, from Europe as well as India, proving these ships made long voyages. But to whom they belonged is not yet certain. It is clear that the Romans and the Greeks came here to load the valuable frankincense, as did the Indians. The local Arabs presumably had ships as well, but none has ever been found, so we don't know what they would have looked like. In fact, much about this small but important port remains a mystery, including its demise.
On this side, we have no idea what has happened later. We have no evidences of nothing. We know that the town died slowly, because there is no signs of fire or no sign of anything. It was just slowly abandoned. This is probably related to the loss of importance of frankincense, which was condemned by the church, by Catholic Church, as pagan use.
With the demand for frankincense abruptly cut, the ships stopped calling. Sumhuram and its neighbors lost the traffic that kept them in business. Most were abandoned and reclaimed by the sand. The written history of Arabian seafaring fades out along with them. The next chapter wouldn't be recorded until several hundred years later. But this time, the Arabs themselves would write it. Of course, writing maritime history requires a good ship, and that the Arabs eventually obtained. Its key characteristic was the large lateen sail, known for its efficiency into the wind. But lateen sails were cumbersome to bring around in case the wind shifted. They required the entire sail and boom to be brought around the mast, a strenuous operation which always required a lot of manpower. It is no different on the Fal-Heer. Saleh has made the wise decision to do it here, in port. At sea, in this weather, the operation would be very dangerous. Small dhows don't sail on particular routes or schedules. They go where cargoes are, weather permitting. For the Fal-Heer, decision time has come. The addition of another cover makes it clear that the crew wants to head out, even though the wind continues to blow unabatedly and is kicking up a heavier sea. But by leaving now, the ship will make it across the Red Sea to Erythraea before nightfall. Although a small dhow, the Fal-Heer carries a relatively large crew. Normally there are 6 to work the ship, along with any passengers looking for an inexpensive crossing. Saleh hails from Djibouti, across the Red Sea. He hopes the vessel will visit there, perhaps after her first port of call. The others are Yemeni. There's Mohammed Osilo, who doubles as cook, along with Ahmed and Ismail Mastur. All have been with the ship for several years. For most, it is also a home. Raising the sail requires all of them, but they know it will help steady the vessel. Saleh knows that this wind is almost too strong, but he also knows how to deal with it. The sail is simply not raised all the way, forming a funnel-like shape which steadies the ship and propels it forward, yet at the same time allows the wind to escape. With ships like these, the Arabs would rule eastern seas hundreds of years prior to European sailors. It was an amazing feat of seamanship, as well as somewhat of a contradiction. After all, the Arabs didn't inherit a strong nautical tradition. Theirs was a land-based culture, deeply rooted in the geographic features of their homeland. Expansive deserts, where life was harsh and extreme. Huge mountain ranges, which offered spectacular vistas and protection, and stretches of wild and dry lands. Of course, there were fertile regions too, where people settled, they and the land nurtured by springs or rivers. But these weren't navigable rivers, where people could learn the art of ships and shipping. In fact, most riverbeds were dry for much of the year. For the Arabs to learn anything about ships, they had to go to sea. And according to written records, they did so very early.
The strong evidence in our hands, it goes back to 4,000 years, when the Sumerian mentioned that the inhabitants of Magan, which means Oman, had exchange trades with them.
Dr. Assam Al-Rawas is a historian at the Sultan Qaboos University in Oman, a nation that is proud of its seafaring heritage.
The Omanis, I think, employed the location and position of Oman. They used to live in the deserts, in the mountains, and after that they go down to the coast. The coast, they have no alternative, only to go to the sea. They conquer their fear from the sea, and when they done that, they were able to exercise their ability over the ocean.
Even so, like all coastal Arabs, they keep us in the dark about their early maritime history. They left no records or ships, and thus far no early wrecks have been found in this part of the world. But the darkness in which Arab seafaring enveloped itself would not last forever. Early in the 7th century, the Prophet Muhammad began preaching a new faith. The subsequent rise of Islam had a profound effect on the Arabs' relationship with the sea. Before he died in 632, the Prophet ordered his followers to carry the word of God to all corners of the known world. To do so, the sea could no longer be ignored. A vast fleet was needed along the coasts of the expanding empire. Strong ships, because the new faith wasn't likely to be adopted by all. But ships carried more than words and their followers. They also carried goods, and the Arabs soon realized they were in a unique position to control the lucrative trade between East and West. And this time, they recorded it. Not in pictures or paintings, because Islam didn't encourage that, but in their stories.
We have a very rich documentation by Muslim travelers, which goes to the early period of Islam, for at least 400 or 500 years. The Muslim travelers, they went through all the lands which is conquered by Muslims. So they went everywhere and they write down their memoirs and diaries and description.
And it is so that we know much about the Arabs' great trade routes to India and Ceylon, and beyond as far as China and Korea. Beginning in the 8th century, this trade route was by far the longest sea route in regular use, and it would remain so for more than half a millennium. Stories about the long trip circulated, and while some no doubt were embellished along the waterfront, most contain a good deal of hard-earned information on nautical matters. The story of Suleiman the Merchant's voyage to the east provides an excellent example. Written around the middle of the 9th century, it tells us that ships sailing from the head of the Persian Gulf would reach its entrance in late November. Then they set out into open seas, taking advantage of the northeast monsoon to sail to India, and from there to Southeast Asia and China. Along with time spent provisioning, the outward voyage could take as long as 6 months. In the great tradition of Muslim travelers, Suleiman and his colleagues spend a good deal of time describing the places and people along the way, but the ships are seldom mentioned. In absence of images or a well-preserved wreck, figuring out what these ships would have looked like remains a matter of speculation, though any visit to a traditional dhow yard will provide an idea. Though the workers use power tools these days, some things haven't changed here in hundreds of years. The adzes were used by the builders constructing T's Nile ships more than 4,000 years ago. Other tools have also survived the millennia, as has the practice of building these ships without plans or blueprints. What has changed is how the ships are held together. Now they use nails. 1,000 years ago, they would have used coconut rope to literally sew the ship together. Until recently, this technique still existed, allowing Omani shipwrights to reconstruct one of the great China traders. It actually retraced the voyage to China in the early 1980s, an achievement that earned it a place in the middle of a traffic circle. Though both the ship and the roundabout are immaculately maintained, perhaps the vessel deserves better. After all, this is the best representation of one of the ships that ruled the trade between East and West more than 1,000 years ago. Getting an idea of what it would have been like to sail these ships is somewhat easier. In fact, the Fal-Heer provides a credible impression. Shipboard cuisine consists of whatever can be obtained from the sea, boiled with rice, much the same way it would have been 1,000 years ago. Unlike his colleagues in the past, Mohammed has access to a small gas burner, making a warm meal more reliable, though not necessarily more comfortable. Meals are taken on the small aft deck, or wherever there is space. Like the sailing dhows of days past, the Fal-Heer is short on comfort. She is crowded, exposed to wind and spray, and unstable in heavy seas. But like their colleagues from days past, this crew is used to them, though they keep a watchful eye on the sail and rigging. This is simply part of their life. Seafaring accounts like Suleiman's, or even the romanticized version told in the story of Sinbad, speak of untold hardships and dangers. But they are always accepted as part of fate, of the will of Allah. In spite of the dangers, the Arabs maintained a sea link with the Far East for hundreds of years. In the process, they redrew the world's political map. Their activities in China were always strictly controlled, but along the way in India, the Malay Peninsula and the Spice Islands, Islam quickly took root. It provided the Arabs trading as well as political partners along the entire east-west axis, and that enabled them to establish a powerful economic empire. Their cities grew in size and splendor. During the first caliphates, Islam rose to its greatest height, its art and architecture a permanent tribute to Allah. But the mosques were more than centers of devotion. Many also became great centers of learning, where students not only studied the Quran, but specialized in all the known sciences, thereby preserving the wisdom of the ancients. And yet, in spite of this legacy of learning and trading, and the Arabs' great achievements at sea, it is difficult to fully grasp the extent of their maritime legacy. Perhaps it is because so much has disappeared. Places like Sur along Oman's Persian Gulf coast still provide an impression of the days of old, with plenty of fishing dhows still being used and built here. But the trading dhows are long gone. New roads have seen to that. Near Oman's capital of Muscat is Mutra, which still sports an attractive waterfront and a lively fishing souk. The capital itself has now been thoroughly modernized, with only the large fortresses at its harbor entrance reminding us of the time when this port was a vital stop in the sea trade between east and west. Further north lies Sohar, home port of the fictional Sinbad. But Sinbad would hardly recognize the place, in his time one of the principal China ports. The city's history stretches back more than 4,000 years, but aside from its stark white fortress, there is little to remind of that. Sohar too has been modernized, and the ships have long stopped calling. An impression of what these places would have looked like prior to the oil boom still exists along Oman's southern coast. Mirbat was once a thriving port. It has been bypassed by time, and for the time being, by the rush to replace the buildings of old. But its days as a port are largely finished, with only the old merchant houses reminding of its erstwhile role. The Fal-Heer's home port of Mocha has also seen better times. Once this was the world's principal coffee trading port, bringing along a stream of money and merchants. Today, only the name lives on. Mocha lost its preeminent role long ago, and along with it, any ambition, it seems, to preserve what is left. What is left of Mocha's golden age may disappear altogether, as was the fate of many an Arabian port. Kalyat in the Persian Gulf, for instance, thrived from at least the beginning of the Christian era. But early in the 16th century, it was totally destroyed by a Portuguese fleet. aside from the remnants of the city walls and a small mausoleum, hardly one stone was left standing on top of another. Local tradition holds that a strong earthquake toppled what the Portuguese hadn't, but of that there are no records nor evidence. In fact, it is strange that this once mighty city, glowingly described by Marco Polo and by the great Muslim traveler Ibn Battuta, simply disappeared, with hardly a record to speak of its demise. Caillat was not alone in its fate. Near the city of Salalah in southern Oman was the great port of Zafar, or Al-Baleed, as it later became known. It too saw Marco Polo passing through, who described it as a great and noble city, with a great deal of shipping. Today, the ships and the people have long gone. It is left for archaeologists to figure out what happened here.
This is Al-Baleed archaeological site. We're going to start the excavation with the German team on Saturday. I am here to check what's been done and to get a general view again before starting excavation on Saturday.
Saeed Al-Salmi is an archaeologist with Oman's Ministry of Information. He is looking forward to the excavation and to the answers it may unearth. Because there is a lot that remains unknown about this and similar ports. Not even the date of the city's founding is known. That information lies hidden underneath.
What we have here, it's built something like 10th, 11th century. Then it's destroyed at 1221 and it's been rebuilt again. So we are thinking that we are dealing now with a secondary structure. We are dealing on the surface only, but the main structure is underneath. The other thing, we think it's been exist for something like 500 to 600 years until it's been destroyed or left behind. But what we are very sure that this is a port, that you have many ships coming to here.
What these medieval ships would have looked like is uncertain, because here too there are few records or remains. In fact, some of the best descriptions come from European travelers, though they were seldom impressed. These ships are mighty frail, and with no iron in them, wrote John of Montecorvino, and so if the twine breaks, there is a breach indeed. Marco Polo was even more critical. These ships are wretched affairs, and many of them get lost, for they have no iron fastenings, and are only stitched together with twine made from the husk of the Indian nut. Hence 'tis a dangerous business to make a voyage in one of these ships, and many of them are lost in that Sea of India. The storms are often terrible. There's no storm in the Red Sea yet, though the wind is blowing harder. But Saleh doesn't seem to be concerned. The bilge pumps are working fine, keeping the hull dry, and the ship is making excellent time. Nearing the Red Sea's shipping lanes, there are some larger ships in the vicinity, but visibility is good. In Saleh's view, it is a fine day for sailing. Most passengers aboard have a different opinion, wishing they would have stayed ashore. But they have been assured their misery should be short-lived. Soon the African coast will be in sight, and along with it calmer waters and a chance to recover. As the Paraplus observed, Arab ships already traded with the African side of the Red and Arabian Seas thousands of years ago. Shortly after the rise of Islam, they also reached farther south, into Black Africa, introducing their ships and their religion. Both of them are still prominent features along the East African coast. Sailing dhows still survive in this part of the world, out of necessity. Roads are few and far between, and boats, no matter how small, are often the most efficient means for transporting goods. And many people live on subsistence wages. They have no money to buy fuel and engines, or even a larger boat. As a result, it is here, along the coast from Mozambique to northern Kenya, that the dhow tradition lives on, as it does nowhere else. But there is a good deal more that survives from the great age of Arab seafaring. As they ventured progressively down the coast, the Arabs established trading towns along the way, which gradually developed into rich and powerful city-states. Places like Lamu in northern Kenya are reminders of that age, their survival the result of a remote location, as well as their strong Swahili identity.
Swahili originated from intermarriage between Arabs and the local people along the coast. It is not a tribe, it is an identity of the people living along the coast. Swahili-speaking people developed their culture, which is blended very well with religion, Islamic religion. And this is very common along the coast from Mozambique to northern Kenya.
Joseph Cheriot is director of the Lamu Museum. Though not Swahili himself, much of his work consists of making sure the city and the culture are preserved. It is a time-consuming task because there is much that needs urgent attention.
We are going out from the museum to go to a site where there is a building being restored under European Union fund. And we are going to see the workers restoring the building using local material and local technology, because we want the house to be restored in the best original way we can get.
Along with Conservation Officer Ahmed Sagaf, Joseph Cheriot reviews the progress to determine what is needed to get the mansion back into its original shape.
It takes a long time because sometimes material is obtained from very far, and sometimes we have problem of transport. The sea does not allow us to move as we wish. High and low tides affect movement here in Lamu.
And that the tides have done for hundreds of years. From its founding nearly 800 years ago, Lamu depended entirely on sea trade. In its day, this was one of the major ports in the Arabs' extensive trading network.
I think the Swahili acted as middlemen between the people from the mainland and the people from distant lands in the east. The countries that are known in record, Arabia, India, China, seem to have had early contact with Lamu and traded with natural material. They collected ivory, turtle shells, and a number of animal trophies, as well as plants from the coast to take to the east.
In those days, Lamu's waterfront was crowded with large dhows and merchants from all over the Muslim world. And all along the East African coast, there were trading towns like it. Not far away is Pate, which once rivaled Lamu in size and splendor. But Pate has fallen on hard times. Difficult to reach, it sees few visitors. The remains of the old city are now surrounded by fields, but they still convey the original splendor of the town. There is the great mosque, along with remains of large mansions, some of them still revealing the niches that once adorned them. What is left of a palace speaks of wealth and power, of a time forever gone, it seems. Pate was never totally abandoned. Other Swahili cities were less fortunate. Along the Kenyan coast are the remains of once vibrant cities like Takwa, abandoned for reasons that are not always clear. In some cases, the arrival of European traders led to conflict and destruction. Other cities might have lacked sufficient resources or have been afflicted with disease, causing people to move elsewhere. Some of them undoubtedly would have moved to Lamu, strengthening its position in the East African trading network. But there came a time here too when the great trading dhow stopped calling. And soon, time bypassed Lamu as well, creating a time capsule where the ways of old are still part of everyday life. How long it will remain like this is anyone's guess, because here too tourism has arrived. For the time being, the strength of the Swahili culture has managed the changes it brings along, giving us a chance to witness the remnants of this age-old trade. Far to the north, the day is coming to a close in Mocha as well, as the Fal-Heer returns to her home port. She is an anachronism as well, her sail kept alive by the high cost of fuel in Yemen and the low cost of labor. But here too, sail is rapidly disappearing, as it already has in most of the Arabian Peninsula. Perhaps it is unfair to mourn these ships passing, for elsewhere too, the old shipping practices have long made way for the new. But the story is about more than ships. It is also the story of the people that sailed them and connected east and west, and even north and south, long before anyone else. It is the story of their courage and their determination, the way they worked together to overcome formidable odds. And it is the story of their contributions, eagerly adopted by others in their quest for the sea. One way or another, we were all affected by it. Theirs is a legacy that should never be forgotten. In the story of the sea's conquest, they were among the last to venture out. But they used the delay to their advantage to develop a near-perfect ship. A ship that could carry cargoes as well as power. A ship that could be used to rule not only the sea, but much of the world. It is early morning in Huzong village, along the shores of Lake Taihu. Aboard the junks anchored offshore, people are beginning to wake up. There are mostly families living aboard. These junks are their homes, and like a home on land, they take care of it. Most of the people here make a living fishing the lake. Taihu is one of China's largest inland lakes, and its freshwater catch is highly regarded. But there are far too many junks fishing the lake, and to get any substantial catch takes days, sometimes weeks. This requires the crews and ships to be well provisioned. With first morning light, the ships get ready to go. Virtually all of Taihu's fishing vessels are sailing junks. As they prepare to leave, they present us with images of a different age. On these two vessels, it is difficult work because they are among the largest wooden junks still afloat today. one has 7 masts, the other 5. That makes for 12 heavy sails that need to be set and adjusted. Elsewhere, sail has all but vanished in China. Here, it has been given a temporary reprieve. Fuel is expensive, and Taihu's fish are few. The only way to catch them, and still make a profit, is by taking advantage of the wind, still free for the taking. Now they look old and terribly out of date. But these junks provide a direct link with the past. And acknowledging that past is fundamental to understanding all of maritime history and its role in shaping our world. The story begins not along the coast, but deep inland. Like the ancient civilizations of the Near East, early China was an agrarian society. And like these ancient cultures, China was blessed with great rivers. Several of these ran from east to west, deep into the interior of the country, opening otherwise inaccessible regions. It would have been here that people first settled. And invariably it was here that they would learn how to move on water. Unlike most civilizations, China has some writings on the origin of its waterborne commerce, but they are mythical accounts. They speak of legendary emperors who taught their subjects how to build boats and how to propel them. But the people living in China at that time probably developed rafts or floating objects well before that. Besides, they didn't need legendary emperors to tell them how to build a raft. Just a few bamboo poles, neatly tied together, worked as well then as it still does now. And it is easy to see how such a raft could be built upon to become something larger and more seaworthy. In fact, the Chinese learned a great deal from nature. Leaves resting on the water directly led to the development of rafts, it was said. Bamboo's segmented structure provided the model for a sound hull, divided into watertight compartments. And the flicker of a fish's tail may have inspired means to steer a ship. But the reflections seen in modern China reveal a different picture. At the beginning of the millennium, business is booming, and every self-respecting Chinese city is groaning under the strains of the never-ending flow of traffic. Seeking their share of the new Chinese dream, millions are moving from the countryside to cities already bursting at the seams. The only way to accommodate the new arrivals or to lure new investments is by building. In every city, it seems, the skyline changes from day to day. And though all this seems far removed from the past, it is teaching us a great deal about it. For new roads and buildings need foundations, which in turn require a lot of digging. In most cities, these holes strike remnants of the past. The deeper they are, the further they recede in time. Near the bottom are the 2,000-year-old remnants of the Han Dynasty, and just beyond, the very foundation of China itself, the Qin dynasty, whose emperor succeeded in uniting the entire country in the 3rd century BC. It isn't often that Qin remnants are found, but it happened here in downtown Guangzhou.
据我知道，世界上船最早的是埃及。埃及有5000多年前的造船，但是到现在为止，埃及还没有发现2、3千年的造船厂。
Underneath the ruins of a 2,000-year-old palace, Guangzhou archaeologist Mai Yinghao found what appeared to be a Qin dynasty shipyard. Professor Mai is convinced this is the oldest shipyard in the world.
根据2方面，一，从考古年代看，它属于秦，那是确定无疑的了。第二， 汉时系的确定也是秦这个时间，这是一了，年代上。第二，从结构来看，跟现在有些土的木头做的船厂那个结构完全一样。另一个方面，发掘的时候所见到的遍地是木炭跟小木片等等。 现在造船厂也是这个现象。
Based on the dimensions of the site, it was possible to obtain an idea of the size ships that were probably built here.
根据发掘的所看的结构，大概可以做宽最小的4米到6米，最宽可以到8米。 长度20到30米长的木头船。
No one can be sure of what the ships would have looked like, though occasionally there are finds that shed light on an otherwise dark era. That is what this pottery model did, discovered in the late 1950s in a 2,000-year-old tomb. It proved that by that time, Chinese ships were quite sophisticated, with plenty of space for cargo and accommodation. Perhaps most important, it confirmed that by the beginning of the Christian era, Chinese ships were equipped with a stern rudder, a device that wouldn't make it west for another 1,000 years. Nearly 2,000 years separate the pottery model and the 7-masted junk. Chi Wei, she is called. Before she was known as number 20, the 20th hull in a series of 100 that were built in the 1940s and 50s. Chi Wei is owned by the Zhang family, headed by Qin Jie, who also captains the ship. His wife Zhoujian is aboard for every trip. Together they have been fishing the lake for more than 30 years. Their 2 sons are also aboard. Xin Hui, the oldest, has 1 son. But the boy's days on the ship will soon be over. Next year he should be heading to school, which will bring an end to the carefree days spent aboard. His mother will be relieved. There simply are too many things that can go wrong on a fishing ship. She will feel a lot safer with her son in school. Rounding out Chi Wei's complement is the Zhang's second son, Qin Dong. Chi Wei's partner vessel doesn't have a name either. She is owned by the Zhang's cousin, whose 87-year-old mother still lives aboard. There is not a great deal of time for a leisurely retirement here. The rest of the crew consists of his wife and their 2 sons, along with their wives. The ship will be theirs next, provided they can continue making a living on the water. Of course, struggling with water has always been part of Chinese life. Early on, the Chinese developed ingenious irrigation methods to make sure water could be diverted in times of drought or during the floods that often plague the country. Though natural calamities had a dramatic impact on their history, the Chinese did a remarkable job managing the flow of water. A clever system of dikes and levees brought water where it was needed. Rivers also provided lifelines for millions of Chinese, offering convenient pathways deep into the country. But since most rivers ran from west to east, their commercial role was limited. To link them, the Chinese began to dig canals. More than 2,000 years ago, the Yangtze and Yellow rivers had already been connected by canals. Construction continued for hundreds of years to link most towns in eastern China by an intricate network of waterways. The work culminated early in the 7th century, during the reign of the first Sui emperor, when the Grand Canal, as it had become known, attained a length of more than 1,500 miles. Running roughly parallel to the coast, the Grand Canal soon became China's main artery of commerce, which made sense because ships offered the cheapest and most efficient mode of transportation. It also enabled the Chinese to bypass the sea. They probably felt more comfortable that way, though not just because they might have been intimidated by it. Early Chinese rulers, in line with the teachings of Confucius, felt that the sea was better left to others. The Grand Canal provided a blessing to later generations, but it became the Sui dynasty's undoing. Its cost, along with that of military campaigns, depleted the treasury and created public unrest. In the midst of the confusion, General Li Yuan seized power. A year later, in 618, he proclaimed the Tang dynasty. For the next 300 years, Tang emperors would rule and expand an empire that justifiably claimed to be the center of the civilized world. Art, literature, and architecture flourished as never before, especially in the great Buddhist temples that played a vital role in Tang society. Unlike their predecessors, the Tang emperors accommodated foreigners. Arab traders were welcomed when they arrived in China in 787, as Indians, Syrians, and Persians had been before. Most foreigners came to trade, and in Tang China they found a wealth of materials. But there was one product which outshone all others. Chinese silks were treasured throughout the world and were traded overland or loaded aboard ships. It was so important that the trade route became known as the Silk Road. But the Silk Road of the sea was largely in foreign hands. Though the Tang government was open to outside influence, there is little to indicate that the dragon itself was ready to venture out at sea. On Taihu, Chiwei has reached the fishing grounds. Before the net can be released, the two junks need to pull along one another, which calls for some careful maneuvering. Junks are extremely well designed for this type of operation. Their sails can be turned without a great deal of hassle and can quickly be lowered in case the wind picks up. There also is little standing rigging, making it easy to work on deck. There is not a great deal to indicate that this place is better to fish than any other, but together, the elder Zhang cousins share 60 years of experience fishing the lake. When they both agree on the location, there usually are fish below. Taihu has been fished by paired junks for hundreds of years, presumably without a great deal of change. Now that the ships have small auxiliary engines, they have become larger, though only marginally because the engine is kept off whenever possible. Both the fish and the catches are notoriously small here, and each hour under engine burns not only fuel, but also most of the profits. The local government prefers to keep it this way. Already, there are too many vessels fishing the lake, putting great strain on the stock. Adding more power aboard would deplete the fish population beyond the point of recovery. And with so many people living off the lake, that is something local authorities need to avoid. Fishing under sail is slow, but no one minds. After all, while this is a working vessel, it also is a family. Much of the day will be spent pulling the net. It is what these ships were designed to do, and considering they have to do it under sail, they do it very well. Then again, these ships have had nearly 1,000 years to develop to this point. Following the demise of the Tang dynasty in the late 9th century, China experienced a period of upheaval, with many independent kingdoms vying for control. It ended in 960, when a military coup reunified the country and established the Song dynasty. But Song China was constantly under pressure by nomadic tribes along its northern border. They broke through in 1126, forcing the Song dynasty government to flee its northern capital at Kaifeng. The new capital was established at Hangzhou, shifting China's population center to the south and fostering more of a maritime outlook. It did so because Hangzhou was the southern terminal of the Grand Canal, as well as a major port. In addition, much of the interior of the country was mountainous, forcing the Song Chinese to settle along the coast. Unlike China's northern coast, it was indented with natural harbors and fringed with thousands of small islands, which provided not only excellent anchorages, but also some of China's finest forest, needed for the construction of ships. Ships of which the remains are now beginning to be discovered.
这个泉州湾这个海底包括是包括那个入海口的那边区地海域里面是有很多的沉船的。
Dr. Li Guoqian is curator at the Zhenzhou Maritime Museum in China's Fujian province.
那我们现在发掘的只是宋代的，实际上还有明代的、清代的都有。
The museum's excavations over the past quarter century reflect China's changing maritime ambitions during the Song dynasty.
因为在过去中国的历史上，过去呢是主要是通过就是 陆上丝绸之路跟外部联系。那么到了宋元时候呢，就主要呢就是通过航海、海外交通和世界呢各国和各个地区呢进行联系。那当时海外交通呢，在这个中国呢这个贸易上和人员的来往上是占一个主导地位。
But these contacts were not always of a peaceful nature. In 1279, Song China was conquered by the Mongol hordes of Kublai Khan. The new rulers quickly grasped the importance of a maritime presence, because Kublai Khan had even more ambitious expansion plans. He looked east to Japan, which had long resisted his attempts at submission. A former ally of the Song Chinese, it needed to be taught a lesson. But since it lay overseas, that could only be done by ship. The Japanese were prepared, however. They had already been attacked by a Mongol fleet in 1274. It was driven off by a storm, but left a lasting impression. Japan knew the Mongols would be back, and in 1281, they were. This time a massive fleet headed back for Japan. It landed at Hakata Bay, where a fierce battle was fought. Aided by a massive wall around the bay, the Japanese were able to hold, so the fleet left for a less defended site. It found it 30 miles west, near the island of Takashima. What happened next is seldom described in Chinese history books. Before the Mongols could land their troops, a massive typhoon struck Takashima. Few of those aboard survived to tell the tale, but clues to their fate have long been retrieved by Takashima's fishermen. Over the years, they have brought up a variety of artifacts.
大きなものであれば船の錨が出てます。で、あとその他には、印鑑であるとか刀であるとか、あとは、石段ですね。開海砲っていうんですけれども、その玉などが出ています。
Akiko Matsuo is an archaeologist with the Takashima municipal government.
これはですね、高島の沖から出ました遺物現行の時の遺物なんですけれども、今はこれはクリーニングをしまして実測をしているところです。こういう焼き物っていうのはですね、形によって年代が決まっていますので、時代とあと生産地を確定することができますので、そのために実測および観察というのをやっています。
And that may help determine from which parts of China the invasion force was drawn.
地味な仕事なんですけれども、仕事をしていく中で自分の中で新しい発見が次々とありますし、あと大きな発見になると歴史を変えるようなことが起きるんじゃないかということでワクワクしながら。
No ships have ever been located, nor are they likely to be found in the waters surrounding Takashima. What remains are no more than bits and pieces, and the memorials to those who perished. Thousands of Japanese were killed, including all of Takashima's population, a tragedy that is still vividly remembered on this island. As many as 100,000 Chinese, Mongolian, and Korean sailors and soldiers never returned home either, eliminating the greatest seaborne threat Japan had ever faced. It is late afternoon aboard Chiwei. After signaling the other vessel, Chang Chin-che decides to bring in the net. It brings a quick end to the peace and quiet the family enjoyed earlier. Ahead lies some heavy work, which everyone has to share. Retrieving the net requires less forward motion, so some of the sails are lowered. And then begins the task of pulling in more than a mile's worth of trawl, hand over hand. Having two ships on either end halves the task, but this is backbreaking work. Power blocks and other mechanical means are not allowed, in yet another effort to limit the ship's fishing capacity. Over the years, the Zhangs have become used to seeing their catches decline as a result of overfishing as well as pollution. But today it is very disappointing. More than 4 hours of trawling netted only a few fish. But nothing is wasted. Even the tiniest fish are carefully retrieved. To make this trip worthwhile, there is a lot of fishing left to do. No time is wasted in hauling the anchor and raising the sails, in the hope of making another attempt before nightfall. China too would remain at sea, albeit after a brief interruption. Hongwu, the first Ming emperor, steered an isolationist course. The only contact maintained with the outside world was through the complicated tribute process, whereby representatives from foreign states showed their subservience by kowtowing before the emperor and offering gifts or tribute. In return, they received gifts as well as imperial protection. When Hongwu died in 1403, he was buried on Purple Hill in the imperial capital of Nanjing. Though he had ruled as a despot, the country had known peace and stability during his reign. But his death was followed by a protracted power struggle. Eventually, Chu Di, the emperor's fourth son, emerged victorious. Though he erected a large column praising his father's reign, he quickly moved to reverse China's isolationist policies. China needed a large navy, Chu Di felt, to convince other states of its supremacy. Accordingly, he called for a massive expansion in China's sea power. By late 1403, shipyards along the Yangtze River in Nanjing were building large numbers of seagoing junks. According to Ming records, the largest were enormous ships, more than 400 feet long and 150 feet wide, considerably larger than the ships built in Nanjing today. But unlike the ships constructed today, nothing is left of them. Over a period of 30 years, Ming China sent its fleets west as far as the Middle East. Placed under the command of Admiral Cheng Ho, each expedition involved thousands of men and hundreds of ships. Yet after the return of the last voyage in 1433, this fleet, the largest in the world by far, was destroyed. Maritime historians have been trying to figure out what these expeditions entailed. But, aside from the official Ming records and one or two eyewitness accounts, they have precious little to go by. But at the Nanjing Museum, historians like Luo Chungzhen continue trying. He is particularly interested in Nanjing's imperial shipyards.
这个龙江船厂在这个南京的这个西面，靠近扬子江。它的这个最初建造的时代是明代的洪武，就是明代的初年。
Following the emperor's death, the records confirm, the shipyard went through a massive expansion.
在明代从这个永乐到宣德的时候，郑和7次下西洋，他的这个主要的这个船队，造船队的他那个建造的经过都是在这里建造的，所以他这个地方呢，就把它一直称作为宝船厂，就是他下西洋用的这个主要的船队都是从这里下海的。
The remnants of Nanjing's imperial shipyards still survive, but whether they will be around much longer is not so certain. Like every great city in China, Nanjing is desperately trying to keep up with the growth of its population. People have now settled on the very edge of the one-time shipbuilding docks, and the city is constructing here. For Professor Luo, it is a concern. He was here as a young historian when a massive rudder post from a Ming treasure ship was found 30 years ago, along with some anchors and other Ming artifacts. Thus far, it is all that remains from what was once a fleet of 400 ships. Professor Luo knows there is more to be uncovered here, but fears that with unsupervised digging so close to the site, it will disappear forever. Other basins nearby have been drained, and farmers still live here. Underneath are more clues to the construction of the great Ming ships, but they too are under pressure, for the city is rapidly encroaching. Their loss would be the final act in one of the great tragedies in maritime history. Given the fact that all plans and records were deliberately destroyed as well, it is difficult to imagine what Zheng He's treasure ships might have looked like. But some people have an idea. Here in the back alleys of Shanghai's Pudong area, attempts have been made to redraw their plans. Billy Tsu used to work at one of Shanghai's shipyards. Now that he is retired, he devotes much of his time to shipbuilding on a different scale. It is here, in small workshops, that some of the country's maritime legacy is painstakingly preserved. Now that most seagoing junks have vanished from the face of the earth, Tsu and his colleagues are trying to recreate them in miniature. It is a difficult task because there are few plans and records. But it hardly compares to the greatest challenge for any model maker, the construction of a great treasure ship.
永乐年代以后，明朝政府实行了一个海禁，禁止中国船驶向外国，这就给中国的造船业和航海业造成了一个很大的悲剧。而当时郑和下西洋的船呢，经过年代很久以后呢，也损坏了，也被人们遗忘了，有的图和资料也闪失了、烧了。因此，后代的人呢，不知道它的确切样子是什么。
But that lack of information hasn't held back attempts at reconstruction. Using all available information, including the few records on the size of the ship and the dimensions of the one remaining rudder post, Tsu and his colleagues have now built a number of models. His is one of the finest. Years of investigation went into its design. It was built from scratch in the workshop next door.
关于这艘船的帆装的样子和所记图也没有确切的资料，但是只知道的史料记载呢，它是有9个桅杆、12个帆。这种帆，很大很重，估计要接近有200吨，因此它分成共4节，有4部绞车分别提升上去。因为这个船很大，帆很重，所以船上的配备了很多的水手和人员，多达2000多人。
Today's sailing junks have considerably less manpower, though they may well share some of the same design aspects. There are the masts aboard Chiwei, for instance, still staggered on the deck to allow more efficiency. The batten sails are similar as well. The hull is probably different because treasure ships would have needed strong keels, but the anchors remain virtually unchanged. And treasure ships would have had compasses aboard, a Chinese invention after all, though the ones aboard the Ming fleet would presumably have been more sophisticated than the one on Chiwei. So here, perhaps, there is a remnant of China's great age of maritime splendor, though it doesn't explain why the country turned so abruptly on it. It is a difficult issue, which has less to do with ships and voyages than with the intricacies of the Ming bureaucracy. But there is an overriding reason. Though the fleets enhanced China's prestige, they did so at an enormous cost. And that, along with pressures on other parts of the empire, sealed their fate. At a time when China could have ruled the sea, it turned its back on it, feeling it was not profitable, economically nor politically. The Ming dynasty survived its return to isolationism, but for their Manchu successors it would prove fatal. In the late 17th century, increasing numbers of Chinese ships began to sail to the port of Nagasaki, established by the Portuguese 100 years earlier, and now Japan's remaining window on the world. Forbidden to voyage overseas themselves, Japanese traders eagerly inspected the goods that arrived. Highly prized were Chinese ceramics, along with exotic products, and above all, Chinese silks. They were traded for copper and silver, needed in China for the manufacture of coins. A large Chinese merchant community was permitted to settle in Nagasaki. It established its own quarter, where goods were stockpiled. The Chinese quickly grew rich on the lucrative trade and built magnificent temples. But their good fortune wouldn't last. Japanese officials were alarmed at the outflow of copper, and early in the 18th century imposed a dramatic limit on the trade with China. In response, Chinese ships began to trade illegally, sailing for secluded harbors and islands along Japan's southern coast. Unable to police them, the shogun asked Matsura Atsunobu, the ruler of the island of Hirado, why Chinese ships appeared to be so much better than their Japanese counterparts. Matsura's reply consisted of an astonishing scroll. It is still carefully kept in the original Matsura residence.
この絵巻物は非常に美しい材料を使って描いてありますし、特に縮尺が非常に正しく書かれておりまして、でいろいろな場所にその寸法が書いてある。
Osamu Oba is a professor of history who specializes in Sino-Japanese trade. In his view, there's nothing quite like the Tozen no Zu, as the scroll is called.
最初に出てくる船の図は、これは斜線といいまして、砂の船と書きますけれど、川を走る船で底が平ったい。それから普通は船の絵を描きますと、海の中に入って見えないところの底の部分までが丁寧に描かれているという意味において、非常に珍しいものだと思います。それからここに
This was a work that could be submitted to the shogun. The intricate detail allowed the Japanese to figure out why Chinese ships were better. Hundreds of years later, it provides us a unique glimpse of these vessels.
そして普通の船は鳥の船、朝鮮といいまして、海を行くための船でありまして、これはそこにキールがあります。海を行く船は大体いずれも同じようなタイプでありまして、ここではその船の出港地の名前が変わっておりますけれども、それは出港地がそこであっただけのことでありまして、普通の朝鮮は50名ぐらいが乗っておりまして、それから川船の車船は大体30名ぐらいが乗っていると思われます。
To make sure everything was recorded, the artist also completed a smaller scroll, showing the ship's components, from capstans to anchors and even the ship's flags. But this amazing visual record comes at the end of an era, because before long, the Manchu emperors returned to the policy of Hai Qin, or maritime interdiction. China would no longer be the place to look for maritime enlightenment, and that made it utterly unprepared to deal with the last ship on the Matsuro scroll. As the 18th century progressed, European vessels became far better armed than any junk. When the two fought at sea during the Opium Wars of the 19th century, the Chinese were annihilated. A few years later, they were forced to sign the Treaty of Nanjing, the first of a long series of unequal treaties, as the Chinese called them. Unequal because they were totally powerless to oppose the demands placed upon them. It is ironic that the treaty was signed here, at Nanjing's Qinlan Temple, because it was founded by Cheng Ho, leader of the great Ming fleets. Within feet of the treaty hall is a large column, which describes his achievements. So here, side by side, are icons of the high point and the low point of the dragon's adventures at sea. On the one hand, a glorification of the great overseas voyages of Cheng Ho. On the other, the embarrassment of the agreement signed at Nanjing. It is an irony that has escaped most Chinese. Then again, perhaps Chi Wei is an irony as well. A ship in a setting from a different age, placed amidst a country that is so intent on moving forward. It is an irony that also escapes most Chinese, or that can safely be ignored. For what happens here is not high on anyone's list of priorities. If all of this survives, it is because of the economics of the fishing business here, not because anyone paid particular attention to preserving it. What will happen to these vessels is uncertain. One day their sails will set for the final time, and if the past is any indication, their future doesn't look promising. For not far away from their anchorage, in a small creek tucked behind the port, are some of their colleagues. These hulls were built at the same time as Chi Wei's. There isn't a great deal that is left of them. With every single one that slowly rots, go the last remnants of what was once the most advanced maritime technology in the world. Nonetheless, the Chinese aren't ignoring all of history's lessons. In the small town of Liuho, near the mouth of the Yangtze River, is a temple dedicated to Matsu, China's sea goddess. Cheng Ho's fleets used to halt here prior to setting out on their great voyages. A building nearby has been converted into the Cheng Ho Memorial Hall. An obligatory stop for local school children, this is one of the few places in China where the great Ming voyages are recalled, where children hear of the magnificent voyages west and the treasures that were brought back, where they can gaze at a statue of China's greatest explorer and feel pride in the dragon's exploits at sea, and where they are told of the great treasure ships that once sailed the western seas. Where these treasure ships once moored, China is now preparing to welcome a new type of treasure ship. Here, along the mouth of the Yangtze River, another container terminal is being built. Though it is far from completed, already the first boxes have arrived. Soon they will be filled with Chinese goods and loaded aboard ships to be distributed throughout the world. Here the quay is barely finished before the first ships dock alongside. For China expects a massive increase in trade. All along the Chinese coast, more port capacity is being added to handle it. And so, some of the lessons of the past may have found new grace. For China realizes that, if it wants to play a major role in the world, it can no longer afford to ignore the sea. Ships are now coming and going from Chinese ports in unprecedented numbers, coming with goods that were previously unaffordable to all but a few, and going with the products that are fueling the economic miracle that is taking place here. A miracle that will forever change the country and its people, as well as the face of its cities. There was a time not long ago when this trade was controlled by foreign powers. Here, British, French, Russian, and Americans set up their commercial empires. But their buildings are now dwarfed by the face of the new China that is emerging across the river. To the Chinese, this represents the shape of things to come, and it probably is. But it could never have been possible without the coming and going of ships, which toil anonymously in the darkness below. In the story of the sea's conquest, they were among the last to venture out. But they used the delay to their advantage to develop a near-perfect ship. A ship that could carry cargoes as well as power. A ship that could be used to rule not only the sea, but much of the world. Dawn at sea can be a magic time. And on a clear summer night, it begins very early. Far to the east, the sky slowly colors. Only the brightest stars remain. Making her way through the Atlantic Ocean, the Portuguese naval training ship Sagres is heading to a tall ship gathering in Norfolk, Virginia. There is little wind, so the ship is under engine. Norfolk is still far away. Unless there is more of a breeze, sailing won't get her there in time. So Sagres motors on in a northerly direction, keeping the rising sun to starboard. Even then, with no more than a few sails, she is a majestic sight. But she's more than that. Because ships like Sagres represent the great age of Western seafaring. An age which shaped the history of the world. The documented history of this part of the seafaring story begins here, in the Aegean. There is an island called Crete in the midst of the wine-dark sea, an ancient poet wrote. A fair land and a rich land begirt with water. And therein are many men and 90 cities. And among these cities is the mighty city Knossos, wherein Minos rules. It was this legendary King Minos who gave these people their name, the Minoans. And it was these people who created Europe's earliest civilization, a culture of magnificent palaces, stunning frescoes, and presumably peace, for none of its cities were ever walled. The Minoans are also considered to be the first great seafarers in the West, but of that there is less evidence. Minoan products have been found all over the eastern Mediterranean, meaning someone brought them there, though not necessarily on Minoan vessels. If ships were as important to these people as is generally assumed, one would expect to find more evidence. Yet, aside from some small drawings on seals, there is none. All we have is the general belief that, since they were the dominant civilization in the Aegean, the Minoans also carried its trade. That may yet be convincingly demonstrated, but until it is, the evidence for Europe's first great seafarers lies somewhat further north, in the Cycladic islands that are scattered between Crete and the Greek mainland. The island of Santorini, or Thera as it is officially known, has provided particularly intriguing clues. Today, tourists come here by the thousands because Thera is one of Greece's most spectacular islands. But Thera is built on dangerous ground. The island actually is part of the shattered shell of a huge volcano, which has brought death and destruction on several occasions. The most powerful eruption came more than 3,500 years ago. A blast so powerful, its effects were felt all over the Aegean. For the people, it was a cataclysm. Their villages were covered under a thick layer of ash, forever sealed from light, it seemed, until one was discovered more than 30 years ago. Known as Akrotiri, the excavation of this remarkable time capsule continues to this day.
We know now that the site was first settled around the middle of the 5th millennium, late Neolithic period for the Aegean.
Professor Christos Doumas has long been in charge of the operations.
Then it goes on expanding during the 3rd millennium, which coincides with what we know as Cycladic civilization. And it was at the beginning of the 2nd millennium or end of the 3rd millennium that contacts with Crete started being more solid as evidence. we have some pottery imports. And the site increased very rapidly from that moment.
According to Professor Dumas, there could only be one reason for that rapid expansion and the associated increase in pottery.
The cause of this is the increase of maritime activities in Akrotiri. Crete had created a surplus through the improvement of farming technology, but she had no means to export the surplus and exchange it with other commodities. The islanders here, on the other hand, had to improve continuously their means of transportation and their skills in navigating. So I believe that it was them who were ready to undertake the foreign trade of Crete, if you like. And this is reflected in what we find here, a small island having a city with multi-storied buildings, decorated with excellent wall paintings and beautiful furniture.
Akrotiri's wall paintings have become the town's claim to fame. Beautifully executed, they provide a revealing glimpse of life on Thera 3,600 years ago. And the story of Western ships will forever be marked not by a simple picture of a single ship, but by a vivid fresco of an entire fleet. They depict graceful ships with high bows and sterns. Some are rowed, the others sailed, and they are large enough to carry many people and their cargoes. Some scholars still believe that the ships had to be Minoan, but that doesn't give credit to the Aegean islanders themselves. After all, theirs are the first Western vessels ever depicted, and in such detail that nothing would surpass it for another 1,000 years. By that time, the Greeks had begun to dominate the Aegean. With them, the seafaring picture brightens considerably. The Greeks wrote about everything. Ships and shipping were often included in art. And if that weren't sufficient, underwater archaeology is now complementing an already substantial record. Just across from the Acropolis is Greece's effort of underwater antiquities. Here are preserved the remnants of ships that never made it, a marble frieze never delivered, amphoras once filled with wine or olive oil, coins for soldiers' salaries, never paid for they were lost at sea.
The people that were living in Greece, they were obliged to build ships to go and trade or to meet other persons.
Dimitris Korkoumelis is the Effort's chief archaeologist.
So especially in the classical period, seafaring, it was very important. We know that from epigraphical and inscriptions, and also the most important, the wrecks. They are the real proof of the trade, of the contact between the cities in the classical period.
Greece's rocky coast doesn't provide a favorable setting for the preservation of wrecks. And yet there is plenty to be learned from what has been found thus far.
You can take some evidence even from one stone, from one anchor, from one amphora. So it's not so important to find really a huge wreck with I don't know how many amphoras inside. Even few pieces can give you quite a lot of information.
And that information is now providing a more complete picture of what it took to supply the city in ancient times. The kind of ships that delivered the materials, the cargoes they carried, even life aboard. It provides insight on the trade routes that crisscross the Aegean and the ports that dominated the trade.
Athens needs everything, so it wasn't a huge market. And for a huge market, you need a huge port. And that port was really Piraeus. We can imagine Piraeus with every day having a big crowd turning around from the ships, take out the amphoras, bring amphoras inside and trying to sell the products at the highest price, and also all the activities concerning the ships. It was probably really a place like Piraeus is today.
Back on Sagres, morning finds the crew busy. There are some 160 people aboard, among them 110 sailors and 25 cadets from Portugal's Naval Academy. Enough to keep Sagres clean and beautifully maintained. But most of the crew didn't sign on to scrub the decks or topsides. They signed on to sail one of the most beautiful ships in the world and to be part of the camaraderie that develops on a tall ship. When the morning winds finally pick up, the crew quickly prepares to raise the sails. Built in 1936 as a training ship for the German Navy, Sagres was launched when the age of Western sail had largely passed. But seafaring nations realized these ships were more than simple cargo carriers. They also taught people in the ways of the sea. They fostered teamwork and discipline, and demanded courage as well as respect. Exactly the values they wanted to teach their young mariners, and exactly the values these ships continue to impart to this day. There is no way this ship could move unless everyone works as a team and knows exactly what to do. Yards have to be raised and braced. Sails have to be set and trimmed. To the uninitiated, the whole procedure looks quite confusing. But there's a clear order and logic to it, as the 10 square sails unfold and push Sagres forward through a sparkling sea. What they teach is reason enough to keep these ships afloat, but they are more than a splendid learning ground. They also represent the crowning glory of thousands of years of refinement and development that started in the ancient Mediterranean and continued much farther north. In northern Europe, people had been building boats as well. At first, theirs were coastal vessels, which were probably rowed or paddled near the shore. But the addition of a sail made it a vessel that could move long distances at sea. No one knows when or where this type of vessel was first built, though its appearance outside Scandinavia will forever be remembered. It was in the late 8th century that the people of England and Ireland caught their first glimpse of these ships. It was a sight few would forget. Wherever they went, Viking ships brought terror and destruction. Soon Europe's chronicles were filled with tales of unimaginable suffering. The Vikings too left accounts, boastful tales that reflect a remarkable disregard for life and death. But fortunately, they left us a great deal more. Viking chieftains were buried in their ships, for instance, some of which were excavated and restored. And in the 1950s, 5 different Viking ships were found in Denmark's Roskilde fjord. They had been deliberately sunk there 1,000 years earlier to protect the fjord from seaborne attack. Though the ships had suffered greatly in their muddy grave, the excavation revealed they still contained a treasure of information. For that reason, the wood was preserved and then reassembled piece by piece. The results can be seen in the town of Roskilde's magnificent Viking ship museum. They prove that the Vikings built more than raiding ships.
A lot of people, when they think of the Vikings and when they're thinking of the Viking Age, they think of complete anarchy. But the society as such was very good organized and became more and more organized into the Middle Ages. And we can see that reflected in the ships.
Tina Damgaard Sørensen is director of the Viking Ship Museum. She and her staff face a busy time because the museum's recent expansion led to new and totally unexpected discoveries.
When we were constructing the harbour basins, we actually found 9 new ships. These 9 ships are very different in type and they belong to different periods. The oldest one is from the late Viking Age and the youngest one is from the Middle Ages. And right now we're working on the ship from the Viking Age in our archaeological workshop. And it's actually the longest Viking ship ever found. It's a very long and very elegant ship that has been at least 36 meters long. So it's very impressive.
There's a great deal more than size that is very impressive about this ship, provided you look closely.
You can see things that are impressive or beautiful, even though you might not see it. So in the archaeological workshop, when you are going close to the pieces from the ships, you can see that all the surfaces are very, very beautifully planed and they have these profiles and so on. And it is even seen on parts of the ships that have been covered by ballast stones or by deck planks or whatever. But you will see it on all the surfaces. And that's astonishing somehow, that you have this delicate character of everything.
Delicate is not a description often used in conjunction with the Vikings, but there is a lot more that is now slowly being uncovered.
I think one of the interesting things about dealing with ships and experimental archaeology is that you have a lot of levels in your examination of the society, so to speak. So when you go and have a look at the ships, you will see 5 very different ships. And that is the first level, to say, well, a Viking ship is not just a Viking ship. They are built for specific purposes and for specific waters. And also the ships reflect different levels in society. So there, in the first level, when you are simply studying the ships, you can tell something about the Viking Age. You have the foundation of towns, which are combined with the trading ships. You have the introduction of Christianity, which are in some ways related to trading ships, because we know from written sources that priests were traveling around with merchants. And so you can kind of combine the different types of ships with some of the most important elements in the Viking Age.
Their ships allowed the Vikings to export their culture to other places and to return with a new set of ideas, which gradually transformed life throughout Europe. But the expansion of trade that followed would gradually replace the vessels they valued so much. Merchants wanted ships that could carry more cargo. These ships are sometimes shown in medieval art, but they often lack detail. Fortunately, here too, the ships that never made it are beginning to complement the illustrated record. The port of Antwerp, Belgium, for instance, is expanding deep into Flanders, a region with a thriving medieval trade. Most construction tends to uncover something interesting in this part of the world, especially at the depths reached when new docks are built. But no one was expecting what one crane dug up at the 20-foot level. Torn apart by the crane's bucket was the upturned hull of a large medieval ship, a victim of a sinking that took place hundreds of years ago.
Op basis van de stratigrafische waarnemingen stellen wij een datering voor op 13e, eerste helft 14e eeuw.
These ships are very rare. For archaeologist Jean-Pierre van Rooyen and his colleagues, it was the discovery of the year, if not of a lifetime.
Het heeft de typische kenmerken van een kogge. Dus aansluitend op de kielbalk heb je eerst een karveel gebouwde bodem, waarbij dus de bodemplanken eigenlijk naast elkaar liggen. En vanaf de kim gaat het dan over in een overnaadse beplanking, waarbij de huidgangen in feite dakpangewijs over elkaar zijn aangebracht. met houten pennen zijn vastgemaakt op de spanten en dan nog eens aan elkaar zijn genageld met stevige ijzeren nagels, die helaas hier in dit geval door het verblijf in het zoute water volledig zijn verdwenen.
Exposed to light and air for the first time in hundreds of years, much more will disappear unless the wood can be preserved. That will require the ship to be removed. Not easy for a vessel this size.
We schatten de breedte van het schip op 7 meter. Nu, er bestaat bij die koggen geen constante verhouding tussen lengte en breedte, maar op basis van andere vondsten schatten we toch dat het schip ongeveer een lengte zal hebben van om en bij de 20 meter.
These were large ships, in other words, capable of carrying more than 100 tons of cargo. Lacking proportion and perspective, medieval illustrations don't quite convey that, though they reveal a ship that is getting somewhat nearer in shape to Sagres. Sagres is much larger, so she was given additional masts. Her 3-masted rig was the result of the late medieval demand for larger ships. First a second mast was added, and later a third. The first 2 masts were usually rigged square, like Northern European ships. The last or mizzen mast, lateen, like Arab ships, a rig which Sagres retains, though the lateen of old has been replaced by a more efficient design. When Executive Officer Silva Ramos explains this rig to the cadets, he is reviewing 500 years of sail development, which began with the oversized cogs of the Middle Ages and remain part of the ship they now get to sail. But theory is only one part of the story aboard Sagres. Every time the wind changes, the cadets get a chance to know the rigging firsthand. Though the work aloft is tough, the 3-masted configuration became the standard rig on Western vessels because it was efficient. 3-masted ships were able to sail into the wind, for instance, which medieval ships seldom could. Spreading the canvas also made the sails more manageable, which was especially important in the past, when wet sails weighed tons and sometimes took the whole crew to furl. Of course, the work was very dangerous. There were no lifebelts in the early days, and death was often a mere misstep away. In spite of its importance to Western seafaring, it is difficult to say where the 3-masted ship first appeared. But there is no uncertainty over who first used it to sail beyond the confines of European waters. The story of Western seafaring continues in the place for which Sagres was named. Cape Sagres, Europe's most southwesterly point, was known as the Sacred Cape, the place where the land ended and the expanse of the oceans began. Here, on this lonely outpost, it is traditionally believed, Portugal's Henry the Navigator founded a school of navigation in the mid-15th century to help his mariners sail into the unknown. But much the same way Prince Henry never navigated, the story of the school is a myth. What is not a myth is that early in the 15th century, the Portuguese left their rocky shores to start the exploration of unknown seas. Why they did so is less clear. Religion undoubtedly played a role, as did commercial motives. Perhaps curiosity played a role as well, a desire to find out what lay far beyond. Throughout the 15th century, Portuguese ships sailed further and further along the African coast, preparing the way for one of the most important voyages of all time, the voyage of Vasco da Gama, the first to link east and west by sea. Now in control of the lucrative spice trade, riches poured back into Lisbon, which rapidly developed into one of Europe's most splendid cities. Churches and palaces were built, and the city's population swelled, attracted to the trade and wealth brought by the ships that connected the country's far-flung empire. If anything stands as a symbol for that time, it is the Tower of Belém, which greeted mariners upon their return to Portugal, or the nearby Jerónimos Monastery, constructed with the money that poured into the city. Fittingly, perhaps, Vasco da Gama is buried in the church at one end of the building, while his achievements are commemorated at the other end, in Lisbon's Maritime Museum. There's more than models of Portuguese ships that is of interest here. Retired Navy Commander Estácio dos Reis has long been interested in his ancestors' navigational techniques.
No Museu de Marinha existe uma grande coleção destes lábios.
In fact, Lisbon has the largest collection of these instruments in the world.
Temos 9 astrolábios, todos eles recuperados do fundo do mar.
The museum's interest in this seemingly simple instrument is understandable. Not only were most astrolabes manufactured in Portugal, they were a vital element aboard every Portuguese ship. Without them, the Portuguese voyages of exploration couldn't have taken place.
Inicialmente, a navegação era sempre feita ao longo da costa. Por consequência, o marinheiro, o piloto, o comandante sabia onde estava por identificação da costa. Quando nós nos começámos a afastar da costa, em virtude dos ventos não serem favoráveis, e fizemos a tal volta da mina, havia que encontrar uma solução para determinar a posição do navio. A única solução era recorrer aos astros, primeiro à estrela polar, depois ao Sol, e assim pudemos calcular a latitude.
There are more modern ways to determine latitude today, as Navigation Officer Antonio Gonçalves knows well, but he remains impressed by the methods pioneered by his ancestors to determine their position north or south of the equator. In Sagres' cadets, he has a captive audience, especially when they get to try the old instruments out for themselves. What quickly becomes clear from this process is that these instruments worked extremely well. With a bit of practice, these readings approximate the readings taken by a sextant, meaning that the mariners of old would have been able to determine their latitude within 10 or 15 miles. That sort of precision was essential to the European conquest of the seas, in which Portugal played such a crucial role. Though that time is long gone, Sagres is a living reminder of it. She, like all ships of exploration before, carries the Maltese cross on her sails, the symbol of the Order of Christ that supported the first voyages of discovery. Its erstwhile administrator was Prince Henry, now given a place of honor on Sagres' bowsprit, and thus a chance to finally earn his title. And life aboard Sagres, like life aboard every tall ship, proceeds along a slightly different pace, punctuated by the striking of bells and watches, and reminiscent of the time when these ships ruled the seven seas. More reminders of Portugal's great age of maritime prowess are found below, in the officers' wardroom, where meals are presided by Captain Antonio Pinheiro, under a reproduction of Portugal's most famous painting. Completed in the 15th century, it shows a cross-section of Portuguese society during the Age of Discoveries. Here, too, Henry takes a place of honor, as do indeed all of the people that propelled this small nation onto the world stage. On the far side of the room is a picture of a Japanese Namban screen, commemorating the times when the Portuguese controlled much of the trade between East and West. There is also a picture of Goa, once capital of the Portuguese state of India. An appropriate inclusion, it seems, though it was drawn by a man who would cause the Portuguese to lose much of their Eastern Empire.
Jan Huyghen van Linschoten was een Nederlander die in dienst van de Portugese bisschop van Goa naar India is gegaan en daar zijn ogen goed de kost heeft gegeven.
Diederik Wildeman, librarian and archivist of the Dutch Maritime Museum, is an expert on Linschoten's work.
Die gegevens heeft hij allemaal mee naar huis genomen en die zijn in een groot boek, het Itinerario, gepubliceerd. Dat boek is zo belangrijk omdat het de eerste keer is dat er een soort encyclopedie verschijnt van Oosterse handel, producten en ook, wat heel belangrijk was, er staat een routebeschrijving in van Europa naar Azië.
Until then, the sea route from Europe to Asia remained in Portuguese hands. Linschoten's description made it available to others, and his compatriots didn't wait long to take advantage of it. Within months, a group of Dutch merchants had organized a voyage to the east. The small fleet left in 1595.
Het werd beschouwd als een enorm waagstuk, zowel financieel als ook politiek, omdat men niet wist hoe men in Azië zou reageren op de komst van andere Europeanen. Maar het is gelukt, alhoewel de reis zelf niet zoveel winst heeft opgeleverd.
And that was sufficient to change the course of Dutch history.
De eerste schipvaart, zoals die heet, komt terug. En dat is de aanleiding voor een heleboel groepen van kooplieden om te denken, het kan, het is mogelijk. Men weet dat daar gewoon veel winst te behalen is. Dus meer dan 6 groepen, compagnieën van kooplieden rusten vloten uit om naar Azië te gaan. En een aantal daarvan behalen ook enorm grote winsten.
Within years, the Dutch government stepped in to coordinate these voyages, a step that would lead to the establishment of the VOC, the United East Indies Company. Large East India ships were built and sent east with people and supplies to return a year later with spices and silk. For a small nation like Holland, this would have enormous repercussions.
De vaart naar Azië is voor Nederland enorm belangrijk geweest. Er werd in de eerste plaats natuurlijk erg veel geld mee verdiend. De rijkdom van Amsterdam is toch wel voor een flink deel te danken aan de vaart op Azië. En het is ook zo dat die handel op Azië en het feit dat Nederlanders zo ver weg varen, geeft natuurlijk ook cultureel een heel andere blik. Men is in contact met allerlei andere volkeren en culturen. En informatie, kennis uit de hele wereld komt in Amsterdam terecht. En dat maakt Amsterdam tot een Europees centrum voor wereldhandel.
But that wealth created envy. In much the same way other cities had lost their position, Amsterdam wouldn't be able to hold on to it. This time the competition came from across the North Sea, where England had been eyeing Holland's lucrative trade with the East and West Indies. The two nations fought a series of ferocious naval wars. Exhausted by the long and expensive conflict, Holland would lose its position to England, bringing her golden age to a premature end. And when it was all over, England not only claimed much of Holland's trades and territories, but also some of the painters who had recorded her maritime routes.
This is a painting by Van der Velde the Younger, and we think it's one of the first paintings that he painted when he came to Greenwich in the 1670s.
Carolyn Hampton is the National Maritime Museum's conservator of paintings. The artist is Willem van der Velde the Younger, Holland's greatest maritime painter.
He and his father came here, in fact, because Charles II invited Dutch artists over to England, really in the sense of protecting them, but also to encourage them to work for him. I think it's a very unstable situation in Holland at this time, and they felt that they would have a better life over here.
Both Van der Veldes did obtain a better life in Greenwich than they would have been able to find in Holland, and they paid England back handsomely.
The importance of the Vandervelde's father and son as regards the history of marine art in England is that they started it.
Pieter van der Merwe is the museum's editor.
The Dutch painters, of course, provide a terrific record of the seashore life of Holland and the wealth and trade in the seaport.
Now through their students, they did the same for England. To an extent never known before, English painters began to picture their nation's maritime doings, leaving us an invaluable record of the country's rise to naval supremacy.
You see Indiamen, of course, and they change over time. You see the developments of naval warships. You can date pictures really quite easily from the style of the ship. For example, in the picture of the St. Andrew, which we've been looking at, the mizzen has got a lateen sail on it. Well, you know, by the middle of the 18th century, the lateen has vanished. And by looking at the way that that progresses, you can date the ship.
Sailing ships, in short, were continuously developing during this time, and artists were there to record the changes as well as the trades. The Indiamen sailed to Bombay and Calcutta, returning with cotton and spices. East Indiamen went further still, to the Spice Islands and China, where they picked up silks and the tea the British had grown to love. And it was precisely this trade that would cause the Western sailing ship to go through yet another major change. But that change was initiated not in England, but in its rebellious colonies across the Atlantic. Nearing the shores of these once rebellious colonies, Sagres has shifted her course slightly. The weather forecast speaks of hazy skies and a chance of thunderstorms, keeping the crew busy as the ship approaches the American coast. There are charts to be studied, positions to be marked, courses to be plotted, and a careful watch to be kept. Norfolk is a major port and naval base, meaning there's plenty of traffic to keep an eye on. For Captain Pinheiro, it is probably the tensest time of the voyage. Of course, he is surrounded by capable officers and an experienced crew, and the pilot will safely guide Sagres to her anchorage. But there's only one person who is responsible for bringing the ship safely from port to port and back home in a few months' time. Meanwhile, nearby traffic provides plenty of diversion, with past and present constantly juxtaposed. On one side, the most modern and lethal warships in existence, and here, a reminder of what it used to be. As Sagres enters the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, the crew assembles on the foredeck to get a better view of their colleagues. There's the Coast Guard's Eagle, along with ships from all over the world. Sagres joins a fleet of ships, the like of which hasn't been seen in these waters for quite some time. Even so, there was a time that these ships were a common sight in American ports. After all, America began as a sea nation. Its settlers had crossed the Atlantic, and for most of them, life was intrinsically linked to the sea. It connected their colonies to the rest of the world, and provided the people in the Northeast with an abundant supply of food. During the years of strife with England, the sea provided protection. Without it, the colonies would have experienced greater difficulty winning their independence. And to retain it, they were forced to make radical changes in ship design.
The British would not let the Americans trade. They wanted to hang on all the trade for themselves, so the Americans had to build something faster.
Naval architect Melbourne Smith is an expert on the ships of the young American Republic.
Morning, John.
Good morning, Melbourne.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
In Chestertown, Maryland, some colleagues are rebuilding a ship from the colonial period. Her lines still reflect the British way of doing things.
The Sultana was designed before the independence, the Americans' independence, and she's very typical of British ship design. She was not built for speed, she was only built to carry merchandise. It didn't matter when you got there as long as you got there.
But simply getting there was not sufficient during the early years of the Republic. During the War of 1812, the British Navy blockaded American ports. To escape the stranglehold, Americans needed ships that could outrun the British. Here, on the Chesapeake Bay, these ships already existed. They were light and possessed a sharp bow for cutting through the waves. After the war, American shippers sought ways to apply these characteristics to larger ships.
The British construction or design rules had started in the early 1800s, and by 1840 they hadn't changed very much. The Americans were free from this, so they started to think, how can I build a ship to carry more, go faster, and build it with less materials?
Designers like John W. Griffith quickly took advantage of that freedom.
He found if he elongated the ends, both ends, the fore end and the after end, and made it sharper, that it would travel faster through the water. He also found that if he lessened the draft and increased the beam, the vessel would go faster. And the combination of those three things was the birth of the clipper ships.
The rest, as they say, is history. Clippers soon smashed every sailing record on the books, making their owners a fortune. Within years, American ships ruled the trades to China and around the Horn. But their reign was short, very short.
Well, the life of the clippers, beginning with sea, which is really the first successful one, was 1846, and the last clipper to be built was 1859. After that, railroads were built across the country, the Civil War came along, there was a recession in America, and there wasn't the big market anymore.
Combined, that proved a death verdict for the American clipper ship. Of all the hundreds of clippers American yards launched in the mid-19th century, not a single one remains. There's only one left in the world. Ironically, she is British. But Cutty Sark too seldom made a profit. Steam was making inroads, and by the late 19th century, there were only a few trades left for sailing ships. The type of cargoes steamships didn't want, carried by massive ships that became known as windjammers. Peking is one of the few survivors. The property of the South Street Seaport Museum in Lower Manhattan, one of the largest sailing ships ever built, is now dwarfed by the surrounding cityscape. But it is clear that this is a majestic ship, and that its stories remain relevant, even here, within sight of Wall Street. On nearby Staten Island, the museum is restoring Wavertree, another survivor of that era. Peter Neal is director of the museum.
Well, these ships were built well after the steam engine had been invented and established. But what you're really dealing with, I think, is an economy of scale, that these vessels, as they grew exponentially, were able to move bulk cargoes over longer distances at a more economical price. They didn't necessarily have to meet a deadline for delivery for these kinds of products. And so ships like Wavertree and then the even larger four-masted barks like Peking were built to deal with these very high-volume, low-cost transportation opportunities that would bring fertilizer from South America to Europe or would take hemp and jute from India to Australia or back to North America. So these vessels had this extended purpose for maybe a decade or two in which they simply had an economic viability.
Like its colleagues, these veterans of the last days of commercial sail were saved from destruction by simply surviving long enough for people to realize their value.
These ships have meaning on two levels. One is their actual history. Wavertree was an ocean wanderer. She moved between 4 continents, and when we talk today about the global village, what we may fail to remember is that these ships were the first links. And what they did was they not only carried goods, but they carried people, in many cases immigrants, and also they carried ideas. And I think that's the second level, and that's the justification for why we're spending all this time and energy and money in restoring this vessel, is for their metaphoric power. They stand for something in our world culture, and that is that they essentially carried ideas from one place to another.
Now the pressure is on to get her ready in time for Operation Sail. But time is very short. Operation Sail has already assembled in Norfolk, Virginia. New York will host the fleet in less than 2 weeks.
Many will see this as a one-time extravaganza until the next one happens. The fact is there are more sailing vessels of various sizes operating today than there have been in modern times. And what those vessels are doing is the important role. Basically what they're doing is they're training young people in the values associated with the maritime tradition. They're not necessarily training them to be sailors, although they do sail the ships and they continue to be attracted to the sea. But what they're really teaching them are the values that are associated, which are things like self-reliance and independence, the ability to work together. When you look around this ship, you see that no one person can put this enormous puzzle together. It has to be done by people working hand in hand, overcoming forces, using mechanical and human means. They have to live together intensely, they have to work together intensely, they have to face adversity when it comes and surpass it. These are all the things that seamen have done for centuries. And these vessels continue to do that, and that's their highest purpose.
Sagres, meanwhile, is nearing Norfolk Harbor and sailing into a tumultuous welcome. For the crew, this is a time to enjoy. For most, this is the first visit to America, and it is one they will long remember. There are a few formalities that need to be followed, including a salute to the dignitaries assembled aboard one of the American Navy's carriers. It is a salute all of Sagres takes to heart. And so these ships and their crews earn a place in the hearts of everyone that comes near them. For the people aboard, it is an unforgettable experience. Wherever they may go from here, the time spent aboard a toll ship helps prepare them for much more than life at sea. The lessons learned here are just as valid on land. But not only the crews are affected. Whenever these ships assemble, millions of us show up to get a look at them. It is worth considering why we do so. Of course, the ships are beautiful, but there's more to it than that. Something rooted deep inside, as if we have come to pay tribute to these ships and what they stand for, to the way they connected people and continents, and to the way they still do so today. And to admire and reflect, or dream perhaps, of distant lands and different people. And to be thankful that they were salvaged before the sails had permanently set.